The moment Eleanor Price stepped off that dusty stagecoach in Wyoming territory, she knew three things. Her past was buried, her future was uncertain, and the man she'd come to marry was a complete stranger. But nothing, not the whispers that chased her from Boston, not the 2,000-mile journey west, not even the marriage certificate folded in her traveling case, could have prepared her for the words that would slice through her carefully constructed hope like a knife through silk. "You look just like Hope," the boy said, staring at her with eyes full of ghosts. And just like that, Eleanor's new beginning crumbled into question. Stay with me until the end of this story, and don't forget to hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this tale travels. The Wyoming wind tasted of sage and secrets. Eleanor Price pressed one gloved hand against the stagecoach window, watching the endless stretch of territory roll past in shades of gold and amber. Autumn had painted the grasslands with a brush dipped in sunset, and the mountains in the distance stood like sentinels guarding something she couldn't yet name. Beautiful, yes, but also utterly foreign to a woman whose entire life had been measured in cobblestone streets and the musty corners of a Boston schoolhouse. She pulled her hand back, noticing how the leather had worn thin at the fingertips. Everything she owned was wearing thin these days. Her clothes, her savings, her excuses. The other passengers had disembarked hours ago at various dusty outposts, leaving her alone with her thoughts and a single worn carpet bag, the kind of solitude that made memories louder. "Miss Price, we simply cannot overlook such behavior." Eleanor closed her eyes against the echo of Headmaster Wilson's voice, against the memory of standing in that oak-paneled office while the Board of Trustees looked at her with expressions ranging from disappointment to barely concealed satisfaction. She'd been a good teacher. No, an excellent one. Her students had loved her, had actually learned under her instruction, had begun to see education as something more than rote memorization and ruler strikes across knuckles. But none of that mattered when Marcus Pemberton decided that her rejection of his advances was a personal insult requiring revenge. "Lady looks like she's running from something," the stagecoach driver had muttered to his partner when they'd stopped to water the horses somewhere in Nebraska. He hadn't meant for her to hear, but she had. Because he was right. She was running. From Marcus's lies about improper conduct. From the whispers that had spread through Boston's teaching circles like wildfire through dry grass. From the looks of suspicion in the eyes of people who'd once invited her to dinner parties. From the slow, suffocating knowledge that her reputation, once destroyed, could never be rebuilt. Not there. Not in a world where a man's word would always outweigh a woman's truth. So when the advertisement appeared in the Boston Evening Transcript, widowed rancher in Wyoming territory seeking educated woman of good character for marriage and companionship, Eleanor had stared at it until the words blurred. Educated woman, good character. Not beautiful, not young, not accomplished, just educated and good. She could be that. She could be anything, as long as it was anywhere else. The letters had begun simply enough. Samuel Hart wrote in neat, measured sentences about his ranch, his son, his need for someone to bring order and learning to a household that had known too much loss. He didn't write poetry or make grand promises. He wrote about cattle prices and winter preparations and a boy who needed a mother's hand, even if that mother was really a stranger fulfilling a contract. Eleanor had written back with equal practicality. She told him about her teaching experience, her ability to manage a household budget, her willingness to work hard. She didn't mention the scandal. She didn't mention how her hands sometimes shook when she thought about facing another roomful of judgmental eyes. She simply presented herself as a solution to his problem, because God knew she needed him to be a solution to hers. 3 months of correspondence. A proposal that was more negotiation than romance. A train ticket west that felt like both escape and surrender. And now, here she was, watching the town of Clearwater Creek emerge from the prairie like a handful of wooden buildings someone had scattered and forgotten. The stage lurched to a stop in front of a building optimistically labeled Hotel and General Store. Eleanor gathered her carpet bag and stepped down into the street, her boots meeting dirt that puffed up in small clouds. The air smelled different here, cleaner somehow, despite the dust. Sharp with pine from the distant mountains and something else she couldn't identify. Space, maybe. Possibility. Or danger. She was still deciding. "Miss Eleanor Price." The voice belonged to a tall man standing beside a wagon that had seen better years. He wore work-worn clothes and a hat that shaded eyes the color of storm clouds. He didn't smile, but he removed his hat, a gesture that seemed to cost him some effort, as though courtesy was a language he'd half forgotten. "Mr. Hart?" She kept her voice steady, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. This was him, her husband-to-be, the stranger she'd agreed to marry based on nothing but ink on paper and the desperate need to disappear. "Samuel," he corrected quietly, "no need for formality between us." His gaze moved over her face, assessing but not unkind. "Journey treat you all right?" "Well enough." Eleanor met his eyes, refusing to look away first. If they were going to build any kind of life together, she wouldn't start by being timid. "Thank you for meeting me." Something flickered across his expression. Surprise, maybe, or approval. "Got a room at the hotel for tonight. Figure you'll want to rest before we head out to the ranch. It's about an hour's ride and the road's rough." "I don't need—" Eleanor started, then caught herself. She was exhausted, bone-deep tired from 2 weeks of rattling stagecoaches and uncomfortable way stations. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. "Thank you. That's thoughtful." Samuel nodded and reached for her bag. His hands were large, calloused, the hands of someone who worked with tools and rope and things that didn't care about gentleness. But he handled her worn carpetbag carefully, as though it might contain something precious. "There's someone I want you to meet," he said, turning toward the wagon. Eleanor's breath caught. There, sitting on the wagon bench with legs too short to reach the footboard, was a boy of perhaps 8 or 9. He had his father's serious expression, but lighter hair, sun-bleached to the color of wheat. He watched her with an intensity that seemed too old for his young face, as though he'd already learned not to trust easily. "Caleb," Samuel said, his voice softening in a way it hadn't when he'd spoken to her. "This is Miss Eleanor, the lady I told you about." The boy, Caleb, stared at her. Eleanor tried a smile, the kind she'd used countless times to win over shy students. "Hello, Caleb. It's nice to finally meet you. Your father's written so much about you in his letters." Caleb didn't respond. His eyes moved over her face, lingering on details she couldn't guess, the color of her hair, perhaps, or the shape of her nose, or some other feature that meant something only to him. The silence stretched, growing uncomfortable. Samuel shifted his weight, about to intervene. Then Caleb spoke, his voice clear and cutting as broken glass. "You look just like Hope." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Eleanor's smile froze. Samuel's face went pale, then flushed with something that might have been anger or embarrassment or grief, maybe all three at once. The autumn wind whispered through Clearwater Creek's single street, carrying the sound of a blacksmith's hammer and someone's laughter from the saloon. Normal sounds from a normal day, but Eleanor couldn't hear any of it over the sudden roaring in her ears. Hope, his late wife, the mother this child had lost. "You look just like Hope." "Caleb," Samuel's voice came out rough. "That's not... We don't..." He stopped, seeming to lose the thread of whatever reprimand he'd intended. His hand moved to the boy's shoulder, but Caleb shrugged it off and turned away, staring fixedly at the mountains. Eleanor stood frozen in the middle of the street, her carefully constructed composure cracking like ice over a thawing river. 3 months of letters. 3 months of carefully worded exchanges about household management and educational philosophies, and the practical arrangements of a marriage built on mutual need rather than affection. And not once, not in a single letter, had Samuel Hart mentioned that she looked like the wife he'd buried. Was that why he'd chosen her? Had he seen something in her few carefully selected words that reminded him of a ghost? Was she meant to be a replacement, a substitute, a living reminder of someone lost? Eleanor. Samuel's use of her first name jolted her back to the present. He stood close now, though she hadn't noticed him moving. His face was drawn, years seeming to settle into the lines around his eyes. "I'm sorry. He doesn't mean... He's just a boy who..." He stopped again, and she could see him struggling with words that wouldn't come. "Does she?" Eleanor heard herself ask, her voice steadier than she felt. "Look like her? Like your wife?" Samuel's jaw worked. Around them, Clearwater Creek continued its business, a woman emerging from the general store with a basket, two men arguing good-naturedly about horse breeding outside the livery. Normal life, carrying on while Eleanor's carefully planned escape route began to feel like a trap. "There's a resemblance," Samuel admitted finally. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw something that might have been guilt or sorrow or just bone-deep weariness. The coloring, maybe. The way you carry yourself. But when I placed that advertisement, I wasn't looking for... He dragged a hand across his face. "I was looking for someone to help raise my son and manage a household. Someone educated and capable. That's all." "Is it?" The question came out sharper than Eleanor intended, but she didn't take it back. She'd fled one set of lies already. She wouldn't build a life on another. "Because your son seems to think otherwise." "My son is 8 years old and still sees his mother in every woman with brown hair and a kind face." Samuel's voice hardened, not with anger at her, but at something else. Circumstance, maybe, or fate, or his own failure to prevent this exact moment. "He's wrong. You're not Hope. Hope is dead and buried, and you're here because I need help. I can't get any other way, and you need..." He paused, his expression shifting to something uncomfortably close to understanding. "Well, I assume you need something too, or you wouldn't have traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger." The truth of that statement hung between them like smoke. A group of riders passed, their horses kicking up dust that made Eleanor's eyes water. Or maybe that was something else entirely. She'd thought this would be simple. A transaction. A clean start in a place where no one knew about Marcus Pemberton's lies or the scandal that had destroyed her livelihood. She'd be a wife in name, a teacher to a boy who needed educating, a manager of a household in exchange for safety and respectability, and the chance to breathe without waiting for the next whisper. But nothing was ever simple, was it? "I need to see her," Eleanor said suddenly. "Your wife. Is there a photograph?" Samuel's eyebrows rose. "Why?" "Because I need to know." Eleanor lifted her chin, meeting his gaze squarely. "If I'm going to stay, if we're going to attempt this arrangement, I need to see what I'm stepping into, what I'm being compared to, whether your son's words are a child's imagination or something more." For a long moment, Samuel just looked at her. Then slowly he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a leather wallet. From it, he extracted a small photograph, its edges worn from handling. He held it out without a word. Eleanor took it with fingers that trembled only slightly. The woman in the photograph was younger than Eleanor by a few years, though it was hard to tell with certainty given the formal pose and serious expression photography required. She had dark hair pulled back in a simple style, a straight nose, a mouth that might have smiled often when she wasn't sitting still for a camera, pretty in an unremarkable way. Ordinary, even. And yes, there was a resemblance, not exact, not startling, but enough. The same general coloring, the same build, the kind of similarity that might make a grieving child catch his breath when a stranger stepped off a stagecoach, or might make a widowed man choose one particular letter out of the dozens he must have received. "Her name was Hope Gardner before we married," Samuel said quietly. "She came west with her family in '68. We met at a church social. She was 17, I was 22. We had 9 years together before the fever took her." He paused, then added with careful emphasis. "She was a good woman, a loving mother. But she wasn't educated like you. Couldn't read much beyond the Bible. Didn't have your way with words or learning." Eleanor handed the photograph back. "You want me to teach him, not just household things, reading, writing, arithmetic, the education his mother couldn't provide." "Yes." Samuel tucked the photograph away, his movements careful. "Caleb's bright. Needs more than I can give him. The school in town only runs 4 months a year, and the teacher," he shook his head, "knows his letters and not much else. I want better for my boy, want him to have choices I never had." "And you think I can give him that?" Eleanor searched his face. "Even looking like I do? Even with him seeing ghosts every time I walk into a room? I think you're strong enough to try." Samuel's storm-gray eyes held hers. "You came all this way on the promise of a man you'd never met. You're standing here asking hard questions instead of running back to that stagecoach. That tells me something about your character, Miss Price. Something I trust more than a resemblance that's only in a grieving child's mind." Eleanor wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that she could be more than a substitute or a replacement, that this strange arrangement could work despite the complications already piling up like storm clouds on the horizon. But she'd believed in fairness once, in justice, in the idea that truth would prevail over lies and merit would outweigh malice. Marcus Pemberton had taught her how wrong she could be. "I need time to think," she heard herself say. "You mentioned a hotel room. I'll stay there tonight. Tomorrow, you can take me out to see the ranch, meet Caleb properly, understand what this life would actually look like. And then I'll decide whether to stay or take the next stage back east." Samuel's face showed nothing, but she caught the slight slump of his shoulders, disappointment or relief, she couldn't tell. "That's fair," he said. "More than fair, given how this went." "Pa?" Caleb's voice drifted from the wagon, smaller now, uncertain. "Is she leaving?" "Not yet, son." Samuel moved toward the wagon, laying a hand on the boy's knee. "Miss Eleanor's going to stay in town tonight. Rest up from her travels. We'll talk more tomorrow." Caleb's eyes found Eleanor's again, and this time she saw past the eerie proclamation to the child beneath. A boy who'd lost his mother, who maybe hoped to find her again in every woman who passed through his life, who'd learned that the world could take away everything you loved without warning or explanation. She knew something about that. Different losses, maybe, but the same bitter lesson. Eleanor climbed the hotel's narrow stairs to a room that smelled of lye soap and pine. It was clean, sparse, functional. A bed, a washstand, a small window overlooking the street. She set her carpetbag on the bed and sank into the single chair, every muscle in her body suddenly acknowledging the exhaustion she'd been fighting for weeks. Through the window, she could see the wagon pulling away. Samuel drove, Caleb beside him, both of them facing forward into a future that might or might not include her. The autumn sun was beginning its descent, painting everything in shades of amber and gold, beautiful and harsh at once, like everything else in this territory. Eleanor pulled out the letters she'd saved, Samuel's neat, careful correspondence. She reread them in the fading light, looking for clues she'd missed. Had there been any hint of this complication? Any suggestion that he was seeking a replacement for a lost love rather than a practical partner? No. Just honest, straightforward words about land and cattle and a boy who needed raising. About the loneliness of a house too quiet. About the need for someone capable and educated to bring order to chaos. Maybe he'd been telling the truth. Maybe the resemblance really was coincidental, and only a grieving child's imagination made it seem significant. Or maybe he'd seen that photograph she'd sent, the one formal portrait she owned, taken 3 years ago when such things still seemed important, and recognized something in it that reminded him of what he'd lost. Either way, Eleanor had to decide. Stay and risk being forever compared to a ghost, or leave and return to, what? Boston and its whispers? Another teaching position in another city where eventually someone would ask questions she couldn't answer. The truth was, she had nowhere else to go. No family to speak of, her parents dead, her siblings scattered. No fortune to fall back on. No prospects beyond what she could earn with her mind and her labor. And those opportunities were rapidly closing for a woman with a ruined reputation. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find a young woman balancing a tray. "Mr. Hart paid for your supper, ma'am," the girl said, setting the tray on the small table. Stew, bread, coffee, simple but substantial. "Said to make sure you had everything you needed." "Thank you." Eleanor fumbled in her bag for a coin to tip the girl, but she waved it away. "Already taken care of, ma'am. Mr. Hart's good people. Everyone in Clearwater knows that." The girl paused, curiosity bright in her eyes. "You really gonna marry him? Move out to the ranch?" "I'm considering it." "Well, if you do..." The girl lowered her voice, though they were alone. "Might want to know that folks around here respect Sam Hart. He's had a hard time of it since Hope passed. Tried to manage on his own, but a ranch is too much for one man and a small boy. Lost some cattle last winter. Behind on some debts. Could use someone capable to help put things right." Eleanor absorbed this new information. Samuel's letters had mentioned difficulties, but he downplayed them. Pride, probably, or fear that full disclosure would scare away his only prospect. "Thank you for telling me," Eleanor said. The girl nodded and left. Eleanor ate mechanically, tasting nothing. Through the window, full darkness had fallen, bringing with it a sky full of stars brighter than any she'd seen in Boston. The Milky Way sprawled across the heavens like spilled milk, beautiful and indifferent to human complications. Somewhere out there in the dark, Samuel Hart was putting his son to bed. Maybe answering questions about the woman who looked like Mama. Maybe explaining why she might not stay. Maybe wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake in bringing someone here under false, or at least incomplete, pretenses. And Eleanor sat in a strange room in a strange town at the edge of everything she'd ever known, trying to decide if she had the courage to step off one more cliff. She thought of her students back in Boston, the ones who'd believed her when she said truth mattered, the ones who'd seen her escorted from the building and learned a different lesson entirely about how the world really worked. She thought of Marcus Pemberton, who'd probably already found another target for his unwanted attentions. She thought of Headmaster Wilson and his board of trustees, who'd chosen comfortable lies over uncomfortable truth. And she thought of a small boy saying, "You look just like Hope," with a mixture of wonder and accusation that suggested he hadn't yet decided if that was a gift or a betrayal. Eleanor stood and moved to the window. Clearwater Creek had settled into evening quiet. A few lit windows marked homes where families gathered. The saloon still glowed with lamplight and raucous laughter. A dog barked somewhere, answered by another in the distance. This could be her home. These could be her people. That ranch in the darkness could be her future, if she was brave enough or desperate enough to claim it. Tomorrow she would see the land, meet Caleb again with fewer witnesses and more honesty, look Samuel Hart in the eye and ask the questions she should have asked in letters but hadn't known to voice. She would walk through the house where Hope Gardner had lived and died, and she would decide if there was room in it for Eleanor Price. But tonight, alone in the dark, she allowed herself to acknowledge the fear, not of hard work or frontier hardship or even of a marriage without love, but of investing everything she had left, her hope, her effort, her battered faith in new beginnings, only to discover she'd traded one kind of ruin for another. Sleep came eventually, thin and troubled. Eleanor dreamed of stagecoaches and schoolrooms, of letters written in neat handwriting and photographs of women who might or might not look alike. She dreamed of a boy with wheat-colored hair asking questions she couldn't answer, and a man with storm-gray eyes offering salvation that might be nothing more than another form of cage. When she woke to pale dawn light filtering through the window, her decision still wasn't made. But the Stagecoach East wouldn't leave for 3 more days. She had time. Not much, but enough. Eleanor rose and washed her face in the basin, staring at her reflection in the small mirror. Brown hair, ordinary features, eyes that had seen too much disappointment for 26 years of living. Was there really a resemblance to Hope Gardner, or did people just see what they wanted to see? Did it even matter if she could give that child the education his father wanted and help build something worthwhile from the wreckage they'd both survived? A knock came precisely at 8 o'clock. Samuel, punctual as his letters had promised. Eleanor straightened her traveling dress, pinned her hair with steady hands, and opened the door to whatever came next. Samuel stood in the hallway, hat in hand, expression carefully neutral. "Morning," he said. "Caleb's waiting with the wagon. Thought you might like to see the place before you decide anything final." "Yes," Eleanor said, "I would." They descended the stairs without speaking, emerging into a morning that smelled of wood smoke and coffee and possibility. Caleb sat in the wagon bed this time, surrounded by supplies Samuel had apparently purchased in town. He watched Eleanor with those 2 old eyes, but when she offered a small smile, he didn't look away. Progress, maybe? Or just the morning light making everything seem less dire than it had in yesterday's harsh afternoon sun. Samuel handed her up to the wagon seat and climbed beside her. The springs creaked under his weight. He gathered the reins, then paused. "I want you to know something," he said, not looking at her. "Whatever you decide today, stay or go. I won't think less of you for it. This isn't what either of us bargained for exactly. Fair enough if you want to call it off." Eleanor studied his profile. The strong jaw, the weathered skin, the set of his shoulders that spoke of carrying weight too long alone. An honest man, she thought. Maybe not perfect, maybe carrying his own complications, but honest in his way. "Let's see the ranch first," she said. Then we'll talk about decisions. Samuel nodded and clucked to the horses. The wagon rolled forward, leaving Clearwater Creek behind and heading into open country where the grass rippled like water and the mountains stood patient and eternal against the morning sky. Eleanor gripped the wagon seat and let the wind pull at her bonnet. Ahead lay a future she couldn't predict. Behind lay a past she couldn't change. And beside her sat a stranger who might become her husband if she could find the courage to bet everything she had left on the hope that this time, this place, would be different. The ranch appeared after an hour's rough travel, tucked into a valley where a creek ran silver between cottonwood trees. The house was small but well built, log construction with a stone chimney and a covered porch. Outbuildings scattered across the property, barn, henhouse, smokehouse, a bunkhouse that looked empty and unused. Fences marked pastures where cattle grazed, fewer than there should be if the ranch was truly prosperous. Everything had a worn but cared-for look, like someone was fighting to maintain what they had against odds that just kept mounting. Samuel drew the wagon to a stop in front of the house. "It's not much," he said quietly, "but it's honest work on honest land. No one can take that from us." Eleanor heard the us and wondered if he'd meant to include her in it. Caleb jumped from the wagon bed and ran toward the barn, disappearing inside with the easy familiarity of a child in his own domain. Samuel climbed down and offered Eleanor his hand. She took it, noting the strength in his grip and the calluses that spoke of endless labor. Her feet touched ground that might become her ground. Her eyes took in a home that might become her home. Her future balanced on this moment, this choice, this leap into the unknown. "Show me everything," Eleanor said. "I want to see it all before I decide." And Samuel, with something that might have been respect or relief or gratitude warming his storm-gray eyes, nodded and led her toward a life that waited to be chosen. The house smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and something else Eleanor couldn't quite place, the lingering scent of a life interrupted. Samuel pushed open the door and stepped aside, letting her enter first into a main room that served as kitchen, dining area, and living space all at once. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel bare except for a single oil lamp. The furniture was simple but well made. A table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair near the hearth, shelves lined with dishes and preserves. Everything was clean, she noticed, but clean in the way of a man doing his best without quite knowing how. The corners held dust he'd missed, and the curtains hung slightly crooked on their rod. "Caleb and I sleep upstairs," Samuel said, gesturing to a ladder that led to what must be a loft. "There's a room down here that was—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "That would be yours, for now, until you decide." Eleanor moved through the space slowly, taking inventory not just of what was there, but of what was missing. No woman's touches remained, no embroidered samplers, no carefully arranged wildflowers, no small decorative items that spoke of someone trying to make a house into a home. Samuel had stripped away every trace of hope, leaving only the necessary behind. Whether that was grief or practicality, Eleanor couldn't tell. The bedroom he indicated was small, barely large enough for the narrow bed and chest of drawers it contained, but it had a window facing east, and morning light spilled across wooden floors that someone had once sanded smooth and oiled to a soft sheen. A woman's work, Eleanor thought. Hope's work, making beauty where the frontier offered mostly function. "It's adequate," Eleanor said, running her hand along the windowsill. "No dust here. Samuel must have cleaned this room specially, anticipating her arrival." The thought touched something tender in her chest, though she tried not to let it show. Better than adequate, actually. Samuel stood in the doorway, too large for the small space. "There's a root cellar out back. Smokehouse keeps well. Creek never runs dry, even in summer. Land's good for grazing, though we could use more hay fields, and the soil near the creek would take to a kitchen garden, if you've a mind for growing things." Eleanor turned to face him. "You're trying to sell me on staying." "I'm trying to be honest about what's here." Samuel met her gaze evenly. "It's hard work and long days. Winter can be brutal. We get snowed in sometimes for weeks. The nearest neighbor is 3 miles east, and town's an hour away when the weather's good. You'd be isolated most of the time, just me and Caleb and whatever you can make of a life out here." "And the threats you mentioned in your letters?" Eleanor asked quietly. "The difficulties with land and debt? How bad is it really?" Samuel's jaw tightened. For a moment, she thought he might deflect or minimize, the way men often did when admitting to struggles that felt like failures. But then his shoulders dropped slightly, and the careful neutrality in his expression cracked to reveal something raw underneath. "Bad enough," he admitted. "There's a mining company, Consolidated Western Mineral, bought up land north of here about 2 years back. They're after water rights, specifically access to Clearwater Creek. Creek runs through my land before it hits their property line. They've made offers. I've refused. Now they're applying pressure in other ways." "What kind of pressure?" "The kind that makes it hard to sell cattle at fair prices. The kind that convinces the bank I'm a bad risk for extending credit. The kind where accidents start happening, fences cut, cattle spooked, equipment that goes missing then turns up broken." Samuel's hands curled into fists at his sides. "Nothing I can prove in court. Nothing direct enough to bring the law in on. Just enough to make it clear they're not giving up." Eleanor absorbed this, understanding settling in her stomach like a stone. "You didn't mention this in your letters, not the full extent of it. Would you have come if I had?" The question hung between them, honest and uncomfortable. Eleanor considered it carefully. Would she have traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man whose livelihood was under siege? To walk into a situation that might escalate into real danger? Maybe not. Probably not. She'd been looking for escape and stability, not another battle to fight. "I don't know," she said finally, "but I deserve the choice to make that decision with all the facts." "You're right." Samuel nodded slowly. "I should have told you. I was afraid—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with the admission. "I was afraid you'd say no. Afraid I'd lose the one chance I had to give Caleb what he needs, to have help keeping this place running before it all falls apart." He dragged a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she was beginning to recognize. "That's not an excuse, just the truth of it." Eleanor studied him in the morning light filtering through the window. He looked tired, she realized. Not just physically tired from the endless labor of running a ranch alone, but tired in the bone-deep way of someone who'd been holding up the world by himself for too long. A widower raising a grieving child. A rancher fighting to keep land that had been in his family since before Wyoming was even a territory. A man who'd swallowed his pride enough to advertise for a wife because he'd run out of other options. She should be angry. She had every right to be angry. He'd misled her, if not through outright lies, then through careful omissions. He'd brought her into a situation more complicated and potentially dangerous than he'd disclosed. But anger required energy she wasn't sure she wanted to spend. And underneath her wariness, a small voice whispered that she'd done her own share of omitting. She hadn't told him about Marcus Pemberton or the scandal that had destroyed her reputation, hadn't mentioned that she was fleeing rather than seeking, hadn't been entirely honest about her own desperation. "Show me the rest," Eleanor said instead of responding to his confession. "I want to see the land, the cattle, where this creek runs that's causing so much trouble." Relief flickered across Samuel's face, though he tried to hide it. "I'll saddle horses. You ride?" "Well enough." Eleanor had learned as a girl when her father had briefly entertained dreams of country living. Those dreams had died with him, but the skill remained. Outside, Caleb had emerged from the barn and was throwing rocks at a fence post with the focused intensity of a child working through complicated feelings. He glanced up as Eleanor and Samuel approached, his expression guarded. "Going to show Miss Eleanor the property," Samuel said. "You want to come along?" Caleb shrugged, which Samuel seemed to interpret as assent. The boy disappeared into the barn and emerged leading a small buckskin pony with gentle eyes. Samuel saddled 2 larger horses, a roan mare for Eleanor and a big bay gelding for himself. The animals were well cared for, their coats sleek, their eyes alert but calm. Eleanor hadn't been on a horse in years, but her body remembered. She accepted Samuel's help mounting, noting how careful he was not to touch her more than necessary. Propriety, even in the wilderness, or maybe just the awkwardness of proximity with a woman who was still essentially a stranger. They rode out towards the northern boundary of the property, Caleb ranging ahead on his pony with the easy confidence of a child who'd learned to ride before he could walk. The land rolled away in all directions, grass rippling in the wind like waves on an ocean frozen mid-swell. Cattle grazed in scattered groups, their red and white coats bright against the gold of autumn. In the distance, mountains rose sharp and dramatic, their peaks already dusted with early snow. It was beautiful, harsh and unforgiving in its way, but beautiful nonetheless. The kind of beauty that made Eleanor understand why people left everything behind to claim a piece of this wilderness for themselves. "We run about 200 head," Samuel said, nodding toward the cattle. "Should be closer to 400 for land this size. Lost too many last winter when the snows came early. Lost more to rustling I can't prove, but no damn well is connected to Consolidated Western." Eleanor noticed how his voice roughened when he talked about these losses. Pride wounded, frustration building. A man watching something he'd built with his own hands slowly crumble despite his best efforts to hold it together. "How much land do you have?" she asked. 640 acres, full section. My father homesteaded it back in '59 before the war. Built the house, broke the first ground, started the herd with nothing but determination and a willingness to outwork everyone around him. Samuel's gaze swept across the property with something that looked like love and burden combined. "He left it to me when he passed in '72. Made me promise I'd keep it in the family, that I'd build something lasting here." The weight of that promise hung in his words. Eleanor understood about promises made to the dead, how they could sustain you or crush you, depending on whether you had the strength to fulfill them. They reached the creek, which ran clear and cold over a bed of smooth stones. Cottonwoods lined its banks, their leaves turned gold by the season. Water burbled over rocks, creating a sound that was almost musical. Eleanor could see why the mining company wanted access. Water was life in this territory. Control the water and you controlled everything downstream. "Consolidated Western's land starts about a mile north of here," Samuel explained, dismounting and helping Eleanor down. Caleb had already scrambled off his pony and was throwing stones into the creek, watching the ripples spread. "Creek flows from the mountains through my property and onto theirs. They've got some springs on their land, but not enough to support the kind of operation they're planning. They need this water." "What are they mining?" Eleanor asked, crouching to trail her fingers through the cold stream. "Silver mostly, some copper. They've got capital backing from investors back east. New York money looking to get rich off Western resources. They don't care about the land or the people living on it, just the profit margin." Samuel's voice held a bitterness Eleanor recognized. The East consuming the West, progress trampling tradition, money overriding rights. An old story, playing out again in this remote valley. "Can they take the water without your permission?" "Not legally. Water rights in Wyoming territory favor prior appropriation. First in time, first in right. My family was using this water before Consolidated Western even existed. But laws only matter if they're enforced, and the territorial government is 300 miles away in Cheyenne. By the time any legal challenge worked through the system, I could be bankrupt or dead." The casual way he said dead sent a chill through Eleanor. "You think they'd go that far?" Samuel's expression darkened. "Men have died for less in this territory. A convenient accident, a confrontation that goes wrong, some trouble with cattle rustlers that gets out of hand. Plenty of ways for a stubborn rancher to meet a bad end, especially if he's alone with no one to watch his back." Eleanor stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. "But you're not alone anymore. You have Caleb." "Caleb's 8 years old." Samuel watched his son playing by the creek, and the fear in his face was naked and raw. "He'd be no protection if things turned ugly. Hell, he'd be another vulnerability for them to exploit. Another point of leverage." He turned to Eleanor. "That's part of why I need someone else here, someone capable. Someone who could get Caleb to safety if trouble comes. Someone who could testify if something happens to me." So there it was. The full truth laid bare. He needed a wife not just for domestic help or his son's education, but as insurance, as a witness, as someone who could keep his child safe if his fight with Consolidated Western ended the way he clearly feared it might. Eleanor should have felt used, should have been angry all over again at this additional layer of complication he'd failed to mention in his careful letters. But instead, she felt something else. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. Because wasn't she also here out of desperate calculation? Wasn't she also using this arrangement to solve problems she couldn't solve alone? "Pa!" Caleb's shout cut through the tension. "There's riders coming!" Eleanor spun to follow the boy's pointing finger. 3 men on horseback approached from the north, moving at an easy pace that somehow felt threatening anyway. Samuel's hand went instinctively to his hip, where Eleanor now noticed he wore a pistol she hadn't seen before. "Get behind me," Samuel said quietly. "Both of you." Eleanor gathered Caleb close instead, her hand on his shoulder. The boy was trembling slightly, though he was trying to hide it. The riders drew closer, and Eleanor could make out details now. Rough clothing, hard faces, the kind of men who made their living doing things other men wouldn't do. They stopped about 20 feet away. The man in the center, older than the others, with a salt and pepper beard and eyes like chips of flint, tipped his hat in a mockery of courtesy. "Hart," he said. His voice carried across the distance, flat and cold. "Didn't know you had company." "Taggart." Samuel's voice matched the other man's tone for cold neutrality. "You're on my land." "Creek's not your land. Water belongs to everyone, according to territorial law." Taggart's gaze slid past Samuel to Eleanor, assessing her with an expression that made her skin crawl. "This the mail-order bride we heard you were bringing in? Pretty thing. Shame to bring a lady out to a place this uncertain." "What do you want, Taggart?" Samuel took a step forward, putting himself more completely between Eleanor and the riders. "Just making sure you got the message Mr. Whitmore sent last week. The offer still stands, $12,000 for your water rights and an easement across your land to the creek. More than generous, considering your current financial situation." Taggart smiled, showing teeth that had seen too much tobacco. "Of course, the offer has an expiration date. Mr. Whitmore's patience isn't infinite. I told Whitmore 3 months ago. I told him 6 months ago. I'll tell you now so you can carry it back to him." Samuel's hand stayed near his pistol, casual but ready. "This land isn't for sale. The water rights aren't for sale. No amount of money or pressure is going to change that." "Stubborn." Taggart shook his head as if disappointed. "Stubborn gets men hurt out here, Hart. Gets their property damaged. Gets their families put at risk." His eyes flickered to Caleb, then back to Samuel. "You really want to be stubborn with a boy to think about, with a new wife depending on you?" The threat was barely veiled. Eleanor felt Caleb press closer against her side, his small body rigid with fear. Anger sparked in her chest. Anger at these men who would threaten a child, who would use fear as a weapon against people just trying to build a life. "Mr. Taggart," Eleanor heard herself speak before she'd consciously decided to. All 3 men turned to look at her, surprise flickering across their faces. Women didn't speak in situations like this. Women stayed silent and let men handle threats and violence. But Eleanor had spent the last 3 months learning what happened when she stayed silent while men rewrote reality to suit themselves. "Ma'am?" Taggart's tone was mocking, but he was listening. "I'm not Mr. Hart's wife yet, so your threats regarding my dependence on him are premature." Eleanor kept her voice steady, channeling every bit of authority she'd ever used to control a classroom of rowdy students. "But I'm an educated woman from Boston with connections to newspapers back east. The kind of newspapers that love stories about Eastern capital exploiting Western settlers. About big companies using intimidation and violence against honest families. The kind of stories that make investors very nervous about where their money is going." Taggart's smile faded. "That a threat, ma'am?" "It's a statement of fact." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "I keep detailed journals. I write regular letters, and I have friends in the publishing industry who would be very interested in a first-hand account of territorial justice, or the lack thereof. So if you're planning to threaten Mr. Hart's family, you might want to consider that his family now includes someone who can make your employer's life very complicated in ways that don't involve territorial courts or local law enforcement." The silence that followed was brittle as thin ice. Samuel had turned to stare at her, his expression somewhere between shock and something that might have been admiration. Caleb had stopped trembling and was looking up at her with wide eyes. Taggart's face had gone hard as stone. "Boston lady," he said slowly, "think you're smart coming out here with your education and your connections. But this isn't Boston. Things work different in Wyoming territory. You might want to learn that before you get yourself hurt along with this stubborn fool you're planning to marry." "I've learned quite a bit about how things work when powerful men feel threatened," Eleanor replied. "And I've learned that sunshine is the best disinfectant. So by all means, continue with your intimidation. But know that every word of this conversation is going in my next letter to my friend at the Boston Daily Globe. I'm sure his readers will find it fascinating. Taggart's hand moved toward his own pistol, and Samuel's hand moved faster, coming up with his weapon half drawn before the other man even touched leather. The two other riders shifted in their saddles, hands moving to their own guns. "I think we're done here," Samuel said, his voice cold as winter. "You've delivered your message. Now get off my land before this gets ugly." For a long moment, nobody moved. Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could feel Caleb's hand gripping her skirt so tight his knuckles had gone white. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods, and the creek burbled on, indifferent to human tensions. Then Taggart smiled again, nasty and knowing. "We're going. But you think about what I said, Hart. Think about that boy of yours. Think about whether your pride is worth what it might cost him." He nodded toward Eleanor. "And you, Boston lady, you think about whether your riding skills will do you much good if you have an accident on this rough frontier. Long way to fall off a horse. Easy to get lost in a storm. Lots of ways for newcomers to come to grief out here." He wheeled his horse around, and the other two followed. They rode north toward Consolidated Western's land at that same easy pace, as if they had all the time in the world. As if this was just the beginning of a game they knew they would eventually win. Samuel didn't holster his pistol until they were out of sight. Then he turned to Eleanor, his face pale beneath its tan. "That was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've ever seen anyone do." Eleanor's legs were shaking, but she kept her voice level. "I won't let men like that control my life through fear. I've had enough of that to last a lifetime." "You just made yourself a target." Samuel gripped her arm, not rough, but urgent. "You understand that? Taggart's not going to forget what you said. Neither will Whitmore. They'll see you as a threat now, not just a woman to be ignored." "Good." The word came out harder than Eleanor intended, but she meant it. "Maybe I'm tired of being ignored. Maybe I'm tired of watching bullies win because nobody has the courage to stand up to them." Samuel stared at her like he was seeing someone completely different from the quiet, careful woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach yesterday. Then, slowly, something shifted in his expression. The wariness remained, but beneath it emerged a spark of something else. Respect, maybe. Or hope. "Pa?" Caleb's voice was small. "Is Miss Eleanor really going to write about us in the newspapers?" Samuel looked down at his son, then back at Eleanor. "I don't know, son. Are you?" Eleanor thought about it. She'd thrown the threat out in the heat of the moment, but was it true? Did she have those connections? Could she actually make good on her promise? The answer surprised her. Yes. She did have a friend at the Globe, Thomas Whitfield, who'd been a fellow teacher before moving into journalism. He'd written to her after the scandal, one of the few who'd believed her side of the story. He'd said if she ever needed anything, she should let him know. She'd never taken him up on it, too proud to ask for help. But maybe pride was another luxury she couldn't afford anymore. "Yes," Eleanor said, meeting Samuel's eyes. "I am. If that's what it takes to protect this family and this land, then yes. I'll write every detail and send it east with my compliments. Let them try to intimidate people when the whole country is watching." Samuel studied her face for a long moment. Then he did something Eleanor didn't expect. He smiled. Not a big smile. Not the kind that transformed his whole face, but a small, genuine smile that reached his eyes and made him look years younger. "Then I guess you're staying," he said quietly. Eleanor realized he was right. Somewhere in the last 10 minutes, in the space between Taggart's threats and her own defiant response, she'd made her decision. She was staying. Not because she had nowhere else to go, though that was still true, but because something in her had woken up when she'd faced down those riders. Something that had been sleeping since Marcus Pemberton's lies had driven her from her classroom. Something fierce and determined and absolutely unwilling to run anymore. "I guess I am," she agreed. Caleb looked between them, confusion and cautious hope mixing on his young face. "You're going to be my new ma?" The question landed like a physical blow. Eleanor knelt down to his level, meeting those eyes that had said she looked like hope. "I'm going to marry your father," she said carefully. "I'm going to live here and help run the ranch and teach you everything I know, but I'm not trying to replace your mother, Caleb. I can't do that, and I won't try. I'm just someone new, someone different, someone who's going to do her best to be here for you, if you'll let me." Caleb considered this with the seriousness of a child who'd learned to weigh words carefully. "Will you teach me to read better? Pa tries, but he's not very good at it." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "Yes, I'll teach you to read and write and anything else you want to learn." "Okay," Caleb said. Then, with the subject apparently settled in his mind, he ran back toward his pony. "I'm going to ride back to the barn." They watched him gallop away, fearless and resilient in the way children somehow manage to be even after loss and hardship. Samuel cleared his throat, and when Eleanor looked at him, she saw something raw and grateful in his expression. "Thank you," he said simply. "For that. For understanding what he needs to hear." "I was a teacher," Eleanor reminded him. "I know something about children and grief." "Still." Samuel offered his hand to help her mount her horse. Not everyone would have handled it that way. Hope would have. He stopped, the name catching in his throat. Eleanor waited, but he didn't finish the thought. Instead, he mounted his own horse, and they rode back toward the ranch in silence, the autumn sun climbing higher in the sky. By the time they returned to the house, Eleanor's decision had settled into certainty. She would marry Samuel Hart. She would help him fight Consolidated Western. She would teach Caleb and manage the household and learn how to survive in this harsh, beautiful territory, not because it was easy or safe or what she'd originally imagined, but because it was necessary. Because sometimes the only way forward was through, and this flawed, complicated arrangement was the only path she could see. That evening, they sat at the kitchen table, the three of them, while Samuel laid out the practical details. They would marry in town in 3 days when the circuit judge came through. Eleanor would move her few belongings into the house. She would have authority over household matters and Caleb's education. Samuel would handle the ranch and the ongoing conflict with Consolidated Western, but he would keep her informed. No more secrets. No more careful omissions. "I'll write to my friend in Boston tomorrow," Eleanor said, pushing stew around her plate. The food was hearty but bland, clearly the cooking of a man doing his best without much skill. Another thing she could improve. "Thomas Whitfield. He's a journalist. I'll tell him what's happening here. It might take months for anything to come of it, but at least we'll have established a record." Samuel nodded. "Every bit helps. I've been fighting this alone for too long. Having someone else who understands what's at stake." He paused, searching for words. "It matters. More than I knew how to say in those letters." Caleb, who'd been quiet through dinner, suddenly spoke up. "Miss Eleanor, since you're going to be here now, can we fix up Ma's garden?" The question created a pocket of silence. Eleanor glanced at Samuel, whose face had gone carefully blank. She chose her words with care. "I'd like that," she said. "If your father doesn't mind, we could plant some vegetables for next summer, maybe some flowers too." "Ma liked flowers," Caleb said, his voice wistful. "Yellow ones, especially." "Then we'll plant yellow ones," Eleanor promised. "You can help me decide where everything should go." Samuel's hand tightened around his coffee cup, but he nodded. "Garden's been neglected too long anyway. Time it got some attention." That night, lying in the small bedroom that would be hers, Eleanor listened to the sounds of the frontier settling into darkness. Wind rattling the shutters, an owl calling somewhere nearby. The creak of floorboards as Samuel moved around upstairs, getting Caleb settled for sleep. Different sounds than Boston's constant hum of traffic and voices, but not unwelcome. She thought about the photograph of Hope Gardner, about resemblances real or imagined, about the weight of stepping into a dead woman's shoes. But she also thought about Taggart's threats and Samuel's weary determination and Caleb's tentative acceptance. About a fight worth fighting and a life worth building, even if it was built on uncertain ground. Eleanor Price had come west to escape. But maybe, just maybe, she'd found something worth staying for instead. Not safety, not security, not even love. Just the stubborn, fierce determination to stand her ground against men who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. To protect a child who'd lost too much already. To build something real and true in a place where lies would get you killed, but honesty might keep you alive. 3 days. Then she'd be Eleanor Hart, wife to a stranger, mother to a grieving child, defender of a ranch under siege. The woman who looked like hope, but wasn't hope. The Boston schoolteacher who'd learned to face down armed men with nothing but words and will. The woman who'd decided to stop running and start fighting instead. Outside her window, the stars wheeled overhead, brilliant and cold, and utterly indifferent to human struggles. But Eleanor wasn't looking for cosmic reassurance. She was planning, writing letters in her head, thinking about gardens and lessons and the 100 small ways she could make this place hers while respecting what it had been before. Tomorrow she would start. Tonight, she would rest and gather her strength for the battles ahead. The wedding took place on a Thursday afternoon in Clearwater Creek's small courthouse, with the circuit judge presiding and 2 witnesses pulled from the street to make it legal. Eleanor wore her best dress, dark blue wool that had seen her through too many Boston winters, and Samuel wore a suit that looked like it had last seen daylight at Hope's funeral. Caleb stood between them, solemn and silent, his hand gripping his father's jacket like an anchor. Judge Morrison spoke the words quickly, clearly accustomed to frontier marriages that were more contract than romance. Eleanor repeated her vows in a steady voice, feeling the weight of each promise settle onto her shoulders like stones. To have and to hold. For better or worse. Till death do us part. Samuel's voice was quieter but no less firm. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed Eleanor's cheek, a brief, formal gesture that felt less like affection and more like sealing a business arrangement. They were married. Eleanor Hart now, no longer Eleanor Price. A rancher's wife, a stepmother, a woman with a fight to wage and a household to manage, and absolutely no idea if she'd made the right choice or a catastrophic mistake. The hotel owner's wife, Mrs. Patterson, had prepared a small meal for them afterward: roast chicken and potatoes, apple pie that tasted of cinnamon and autumn. She fussed over Eleanor with the kind of maternal concern that made Eleanor's throat tight, having lost her own mother years ago to pneumonia. "You need anything out at that ranch? You send word," Mrs. Patterson insisted, pressing a basket of preserves into Eleanor's hands. "Sam Hart's good people, but that's a lonely life for a woman used to city living. Don't be too proud to ask for help when you need it." Eleanor thanked her, touched by the kindness from a woman who was essentially a stranger. It was different here, she was learning. The isolation bred a kind of interdependence that Boston's crowded streets had never required. Out here, your neighbors might be miles away, but they were also your lifeline when trouble came. And trouble was coming. Eleanor could feel it in the way Samuel kept glancing toward the windows, in the tightness around his mouth, and how his hand drifted toward his pistol whenever footsteps approached. The confrontation with Taggart had changed something. Lines had been drawn. War had been declared, even if no shots had been fired yet. They loaded the wagon with Eleanor's few belongings and supplies Samuel had purchased: flour, sugar, ammunition, lamp oil, the practical necessities of frontier life. Caleb climbed into the back without being asked, and Eleanor took her place beside Samuel on the bench. Her place. Her husband. Strange words for a strange new reality. The ride back to the ranch passed in near silence, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Eleanor watched the landscape roll past, trying to memorize the landmarks. That distinctive rock formation, the bend in the road where cottonwoods grew thick, the place where you could first glimpse the ranch buildings nestled in their valley. This was her home now. She needed to know every inch of it. Samuel had to leave for Cheyenne 3 days later, taking a dozen head of cattle to sell at the stockyards. It was a trip he couldn't postpone. They needed the money desperately, needed to make payments on debts that were coming due faster than the seasons changed. He'd been planning it for weeks, long before Eleanor arrived, and there was no question of canceling now. "I'll be gone 4 days, maybe 5 if the weather turns," Samuel said the morning before his departure. They were in the barn, where he was checking tack and preparing for the journey. Eleanor had come to help, though she wasn't sure what help she could actually provide. "Ben Cartwright from the neighboring ranch will swing by once or twice. He knows to keep an eye on things while I'm away." Eleanor nodded, running her hand along the smooth wood of a stall door. The barn smelled of hay and horses and leather, earthy and honest. "We'll be fine. It's only a few days." "Keep the rifle loaded. You know how to shoot?" Samuel glanced at her, his expression serious. "My father taught me when I was young. I'm not an expert, but I can manage." Eleanor met his eyes. You're worried about more than just cattle rustlers and coyotes, aren't you? Samuel set down the bridle he'd been inspecting. Taggart hasn't made any moves since that day at the creek. That worries me more than if he had. Men like that don't forget. They don't forgive. They just wait for the right opportunity. He moved closer, his voice dropping. Eleanor, if anything happens while I'm gone, anything that feels wrong or dangerous, you take Caleb and you ride to the Cartwrights. Don't try to be brave. Don't try to defend the property. Just get yourself and my son to safety. You understand? The intensity in his face startled her. This wasn't just caution. This was real fear, barely contained. You think they'll come while you're away? That they're waiting for exactly that? I think desperate men do desperate things when they see an opening. And a ranch with just a woman and child is an opening. Samuel's hand came up, hovering near Eleanor's shoulder before dropping back to his side, as if he'd forgotten they didn't have the kind of marriage where casual touches came easily. I wouldn't leave if I didn't have to, but those cattle are our survival. Without the money from this sale, we'll lose the ranch anyway, threat or no threat. Eleanor understood the trap he was in. Stay and protect his family, but lose everything financially, or leave and risk everything personally, but have a chance at financial survival. No good choices, just the lesser of evils. We'll be careful, Eleanor promised, and Caleb is smarter than those men give him credit for. If trouble comes, he'll know to listen to me. He trusts you. Samuel's voice softened slightly. I see it in how he follows you around, asking questions. He hasn't done that since Hope died. Hasn't let himself get close to anyone. He's a good boy, just lonely and grieving. Eleanor thought of Caleb, who'd spent the past 3 days shadowing her as she learned the rhythms of the ranch, showing her where Hope had planted herbs where the chickens liked to hide their eggs, which cattle were gentle and which had mean streaks. Opening up in small increments, testing whether she'd stay or leave like everyone else seemed to in his short life. Samuel nodded, then seemed to catch himself in a moment of vulnerability. He stepped back, his expression closing off again into that careful neutrality Eleanor was learning to read as discomfort with emotion. I'll be back as soon as I can. Keep the doors locked at night. Don't go far from the house. And if Ben doesn't show up when he's supposed to, that's a warning sign. It might mean they've gotten to him somehow. The casual way Samuel discussed potential violence sent ice through Eleanor's veins, but she kept her face calm, her voice steady. We'll be fine, Samuel. Make your sale, get a good price, and come home. That's all that matters. He left before dawn the next morning, taking 2 ranch hands Eleanor hadn't even known he employed, drifters who worked for food and a place to sleep more than wages, Samuel had explained. The house felt larger without him, emptier, even though he'd only been a quiet presence at meals and in the evenings. Eleanor stood on the porch watching the dust settle from his departure, Caleb pressed against her side. Pa always comes back, Caleb said, though it sounded more like he was trying to convince himself than reassure Eleanor. Of course he does. Eleanor rested her hand on the boy's shoulder. Now, how about we tackle those arithmetic lessons you've been avoiding? The next 3 days passed in a rhythm of work and watchfulness. Eleanor threw herself into managing the household with the same intensity she'd once brought to teaching. She inventoried the pantry, discovering that Samuel had been living on salt pork and beans for months. She reorganized the kitchen, finding places for things that had been shoved randomly onto shelves. She started a sourdough starter and planned meals that would stretch their limited supplies while providing actual nutrition. And she taught Caleb. Every afternoon they sat at the kitchen table with his slate and the few books Samuel owned, a Bible, a farmer's almanac, a volume of Shakespeare that had belonged to his mother. Eleanor discovered that Caleb could read better than he'd let on, but that he struggled with writing and numbers. She worked with him patiently, praising small improvements, never showing frustration when he struggled. My ma used to read to me, Caleb admitted one afternoon, his slate covered with carefully practiced letters, from the Bible mostly. She liked the stories about brave people doing hard things. Eleanor thought about Hope, about a woman who couldn't read well herself but had valued stories enough to struggle through them for her son. Your mother sounds like she was very brave herself, coming west, building a life here, raising you in this wild place. Caleb nodded, his pencil stilling. She wasn't scared of anything, not storms or wild animals or anything. He looked up at Eleanor, his expression achingly young. Are you scared? Of what those men might do? The question deserved honesty. Yes, Eleanor admitted. I'm scared, but being scared doesn't mean we stop doing what needs to be done. It just means we're careful and smart about how we do it. Ma said something like that once. Caleb returned to his letters, and Eleanor saw the ghost of a smile on his face. Not comparing her to Hope this time, just noting a similarity with something that felt like approval rather than accusation. Progress, Eleanor thought. Slow and fragile, but progress nonetheless. The trouble came on the fourth night. Eleanor had gone to bed later than usual, having spent the evening baking bread for the next day and writing a long letter to Thomas Whitfield detailing everything that had happened since her arrival. She'd just blown out her lamp when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Not the usual night noises of the ranch settling, but something else. Something deliberate. Horses. Multiple horses, moving quietly, but not quite quietly enough. Eleanor's heart slammed against her ribs. She threw off her blankets and crossed to the window in her nightgown, peering through the gap in the curtains. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to cast shadows, and in those shadows she could make out shapes. 4 men, maybe 5, dismounting near the barn, moving with purpose toward it, carrying something she couldn't quite see. Then she smelled it. Smoke. Terror and rage flooded through her in equal measure. They were going to burn the barn, destroy Samuel's livelihood in one night while he was away and couldn't defend it. Kill the animals trapped inside, take away his ability to work the land, force him into bankruptcy through sheer destruction. Eleanor didn't stop to think. She grabbed the rifle Samuel had left loaded by the door and ran for the stairs. "Caleb!" Her voice came out sharp and urgent. "Caleb, wake up now!" The boy appeared at the top of the ladder, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "What's wrong?" "Men are trying to burn the barn. I need you to run to the Cartwright's ranch as fast as you can. Take the buckskin pony. He knows the way even in the dark. Tell them what's happening. Can you do that?" Caleb's face went pale but determined. "What about you?" "I'm going to stop them." Eleanor was already moving toward the door, checking the rifle's load with hands that shook but held steady. "Go now, Caleb. Don't argue. Just go." She didn't wait to see if he obeyed. She couldn't afford to. Through the window, she could see flames beginning to lick at the barn's wooden walls. If it caught fully, nothing would save it. And if the fire spread to the dry grass around it, the whole ranch could go up. Eleanor threw open the front door and stepped onto the porch, the rifle raised to her shoulder. The men near the barn spun around, clearly not expecting resistance. In the firelight, she recognized Taggart's distinctive silhouette. "That's far enough!" Eleanor's voice rang out across the yard, steadier than she felt. "Step away from that barn or I will shoot!" Taggart laughed, the sound carrying across the distance between them. "Boston lady! Didn't expect to see you playing ranch defender. Where's that husband of yours? Run off and left you alone?" "I said step away from the barn." Eleanor aimed at the ground near Taggart's feet and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, the shot echoing like thunder. Dirt exploded inches from where Taggart stood. The men scattered, cursing. Taggart dove behind a water trough, drawing his own weapon. "You just made a big mistake, lady. You think you can shoot at me and walk away?" Eleanor's mind raced. She'd bought herself seconds, maybe a minute, but she was one woman with one rifle against 5 armed men. The barn was already burning, flames spreading faster than she'd anticipated. And Caleb, she prayed he'd listened, prayed he was already riding hard for the Cartwrights. She fired again, this time aiming for one of the men trying to circle around toward the house. The shot went wide, but it made them think twice about advancing. "Reload." Her hands fumbled with the ammunition, muscle memory from childhood lessons coming back in fragmented pieces. "Get the bullet in. Ram it home. Cock the hammer." "You can't hold us off forever," Taggart shouted. "And when we're done with you, Hart's going to come home to ashes and a widow's grave." The threat crystallized something in Eleanor. She'd spent months running from men who thought they could intimidate her into silence. Marcus Pemberton with his lies, Headmaster Wilson with his cowardice, the whole social machinery of Boston that had ground her reputation to dust. And now these men, thinking a woman alone was easy prey. She was done running. Eleanor stepped off of the porch and moved toward the barn, firing as she went. Not trying to hit anyone, she wasn't a good enough shot for that in the dark, but creating enough chaos to keep them pinned down. Her nightgown caught on something and tore. Smoke stung her eyes. The heat from the flames grew stronger as she got closer. The horses. She could hear them screaming inside the barn, terrified and trapped. If she could just get to the door, could let them out before the roof collapsed. A bullet whined past her ear, close enough that she felt the displacement of air. Eleanor dropped to the ground, her heart hammering. Too close. That had been too close. She raised the rifle again, but before she could fire, she heard something that made hope surge through her chest. More horses, coming fast, and voices, men's voices, shouting. What the hell? Taggart spun toward the sound. Coming up the road was a group of riders, their horses dark shapes against the moonlit sky. 6, maybe 7 of them. The Cartwrights in their hands, Eleanor realized. Caleb had made it. Her brave, fierce stepson had gotten help. Taggart! Ben Cartwright's voice boomed across the yard. You and your boys get off Hart's land before this turns into something you won't walk away from. The tide had turned. Taggart's men were already moving toward their horses, the odds no longer in their favor. But Taggart himself stood his ground for a moment longer, his face twisted with fury in the firelight. This isn't over, he snarled toward Eleanor. You tell Hart this is just the beginning. Mr. Whitmore doesn't take kindly to being threatened by some Eastern schoolteacher with a big mouth. Then he was on his horse and riding hard toward the northern boundary, his men following. The Cartwrights let them go, more concerned with the fire than pursuit. Ben dismounted and ran toward Eleanor, his weathered face creased with concern. Mrs. Hart, are you hit? Are you hurt? He gripped her shoulders, checking for injuries. I'm fine. Eleanor tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't quite hold her. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was draining away, leaving her shaking. The barn. We have to save the horses. Already on it. One of Cartwright's sons was throwing open the barn doors, leading terrified animals out into the safety of the yard. The flames were concentrated on one corner, the section Taggart's men had deliberately fired. If they worked fast, they might save most of the structure. The next hour passed in a blur of frantic activity. Bucket brigades from the creek, men beating out flames with wet blankets. Eleanor worked alongside them, her ruined nightgown soaked and filthy, her hands blistered, her throat raw from smoke. But slowly, agonizingly, they brought the fire under control. By the time the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky, the barn still stood, damaged, blackened, but standing. Eleanor sank down on the porch steps, every muscle in her body screaming. Caleb appeared beside her, wrapped in a blanket someone had given him. He'd ridden back with the Cartwrights, refusing to stay behind where it was safe. You did it, he whispered, his eyes huge. You stopped them. We stopped them, Eleanor corrected, pulling him close despite her filthy state. You rode for help. You were so brave, Caleb, so brave. I was scared the whole time, Caleb admitted into her shoulder. Being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing what needs to be done even when you're terrified. Eleanor stroked his hair, feeling him tremble against her stepson, her responsibility, the child she'd promised to protect. Ben Cartwright approached, his face grim. Mrs. Hart, you did something either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish tonight. Not sure which yet. Probably both, Eleanor admitted, but I couldn't just let them destroy everything Samuel's worked for, everything his father built. No, I suppose you couldn't. Ben shook his head slowly. But you understand what this means? They came after you directly, threatened to kill you. This has escalated beyond intimidation and property damage. This is attempted murder. Eleanor nodded, too tired to be properly afraid anymore. I know, and I'm writing to the territorial governor about it, and the newspapers, and anyone else who might listen. This ends now, Mr. Cartwright. One way or another, this ends. Samuel Hart is a lucky man, Ben said quietly. Not many women would have stood their ground like that. Not many women have run out of places to run to, Eleanor replied. She looked at the damaged barn, at the exhausted men who'd fought the fire, at Caleb pressed against her side. This is my home now, my family. I'm not letting anyone take it without a fight. The sun rose over the Wyoming territory, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, the same sun that had risen the day Eleanor arrived, uncertain and afraid and looking for escape. But the woman sitting on these porch steps wasn't that woman anymore. That woman had been shaped by loss and betrayal into someone smaller, someone who'd accepted silence as the price of survival. This woman, Eleanor Hart, wife and stepmother, and defender of a ranch under siege, had remembered something she'd forgotten in the halls of that Boston schoolhouse. She had a voice. She had strength. She had the capacity to stand against men who thought power and threats were enough to break her. They'd been wrong. Samuel returned 2 days later to find his barn damaged but standing, his wife sporting bruises and burns, and his son looking at Eleanor like she'd hung the moon. Ben Cartwright and 2 of his sons were still there, helping with repairs and standing guard in case Taggart decided to make another attempt. Eleanor watched from the porch as Samuel dismounted, his eyes taking in the scene with growing comprehension and horror. He moved toward her in 3 long strides, his hands gripping her arms almost too tight. "What happened? Ben's boy said something about a fire, but I thought—" He stopped, his gaze moving over her face, cataloging every bruise and scratch. "You fought them. Alone." "Not alone. Caleb rode for help. The Cartwrights came." Eleanor kept her voice steady despite the intensity of Samuel's grip, despite the raw emotion in his face. "We saved the barn. Most of it, anyway, and we sent Taggart and his men running." "You could have been killed." Samuel's voice cracked on the last word. "I told you to run, to take Caleb and get to safety. Why didn't you run?" Eleanor met his eyes, seeing in them something she hadn't seen before. Not just fear or anger, but genuine anguish at the thought of losing her. Not as a convenient solution to his problems, but as a person he was beginning to care about, despite the practical origins of their marriage. "Because I'm tired of running," Eleanor said simply, "and because this is my home too now. Mine to defend. Mine to fight for." She paused, then added more softly, "I'm not Hope, Samuel. I'll never be Hope. But I'm here, and I'm staying, and anyone who wants to drive me away is going to have to do a hell of a lot more than burn a barn and make threats." Samuel stared at her for a long moment. Then, to her complete surprise, he pulled her against his chest in an embrace that was fierce and desperate and absolutely nothing like their formal wedding kiss. Eleanor felt his heart hammering against her cheek, felt the tremor in his hands where they pressed against her back. "I thought I'd lost another one," he whispered into her hair. "Thought I'd come home to find you gone, and it would be my fault for leaving, for not protecting you, for bringing you into this mess." Eleanor's arms came up around him, returning the embrace. They stood like that for a long moment, 2 damaged people holding each other in the wreckage of violence, finding something unexpected in the ruins. Not love. Not yet. But the foundation on which love might eventually build, if they were both brave enough to let it. When they finally pulled apart, Eleanor saw Caleb watching them with an expression of cautious hope. And beyond him, she saw Ben Cartwright smiling slightly, as if he recognized something in their interaction that Eleanor herself was only beginning to understand. This strange, unlikely family was becoming real, built not on resemblances or replacements or practical arrangements, but on something far more solid, on standing together when trouble came, on protecting what mattered, even at great personal cost, on choosing to stay when running would have been easier. The barn could be repaired, the threats could be faced. The fight was far from over. But Eleanor Hart had found what she'd been searching for without even knowing she wanted it. Not escape, not safety, not even a fresh start. She'd found a reason to stand and fight, and in this harsh frontier where survival itself was a daily battle, that might be worth more than all the security and respectability Boston could have ever offered. Samuel spent the next week repairing what Taggart's fire had damaged, his movements sharp with barely contained fury. Eleanor watched him work from the kitchen window as she kneaded bread dough, noting how he attacked each task with an intensity that bordered on violence. He was angry at Taggart, at Consolidated Western, but mostly at himself for leaving his family vulnerable. No amount of reassurance from Eleanor or Ben Cartwright could ease the guilt she saw carved into the lines of his face. "He blames himself," Ben said quietly one afternoon, accepting the coffee Eleanor offered. Most of the neighbors had gone home, satisfied the immediate danger had passed, but Ben had stayed on to help with repairs and keep watch. "Sam's always been like that. Takes responsibility for things beyond his control, then punishes himself when they go wrong." Eleanor glanced toward the barn where Samuel was replacing charred boards, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the autumn chill. He didn't set that fire. He didn't invite this conflict. Consolidated Western chose to escalate. Try telling him that. Ben shook his head. When Hope died, he blamed himself for not getting the doctor fast enough, even though everyone knew the fever was too far gone by the time symptoms showed. Took him near 2 years to stop torturing himself over it. The mention of Hope still created an uncomfortable twinge in Eleanor's chest, though she was learning to live with being compared to a ghost. How long has he been fighting Consolidated Western? Started about 18 months ago, when they first approached him about selling water rights. They were polite enough at first, made it sound like a business proposition that would benefit everyone. But Sam's not stupid, he saw through it. Once he said no, things got ugly. Ben sipped his coffee, his weathered face thoughtful. Problem is, they've got money and political connections. Sam's just got stubbornness and a legitimate legal claim. In a fair fight, the law would be on his side. But fights involving men like Maxwell Whitmore are rarely fair. Eleanor had done her research since the confrontation with Taggart. Maxwell Whitmore was the owner and primary investor in Consolidated Western Mineral, a man who'd made his fortune in silver speculation during the Nevada boom, and now sought to replicate that success in Wyoming. He had connections to territorial politicians, judges, and business interests that stretched all the way to Washington. The kind of man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted through whatever means necessary. I've written to my contact in Boston, Eleanor said, Thomas Whitfield at the Globe. Told him everything, the intimidation, the threats, the attempted arson. He's interested in the story. Says Eastern readers are fascinated by tales of corporate overreach in the territories. Ben's eyebrows rose. That's bold. Whitmore won't like having his business practices exposed to public scrutiny. I'm counting on it. Eleanor set down her own coffee cup, her jaw set. Men like Whitmore operate in shadows. They rely on distance and anonymity to do things they'd never attempt if the whole country was watching. Shine enough light on their methods, and they'll either have to change tactics or face consequences from their own investors. Or they'll get desperate and dangerous, Ben's voice carried a warning. Cornered animals bite hardest, Eleanor. You sure you want to provoke them further? Eleanor thought about the night of the fire, about standing in her nightgown with a rifle while men threatened to kill her, about the terror in Caleb's eyes, and the smell of smoke, and the absolute certainty that she would not, could not, let them win through fear alone. They already tried to burn us out and murder me in the process. I'm not sure how much more provoked they can get. Fair point. Ben allowed himself a small smile. You're different than I expected, Mrs. Hart. When Sam told me he was sending for a mail-order bride from Boston, I figured you'd last maybe a month before the isolation and hardship sent you running back east. Glad to be wrong. Eleanor returned to her bread dough, kneading with steady rhythm. I had my reasons for leaving Boston, and I'm discovering I have even better reasons for staying here. She didn't elaborate, and Ben was too polite to pry. But as Eleanor worked, she thought about those reasons. About Caleb, who'd started calling her Eleanor Ma, in an unconscious blend that made her heart ache. About this ranch that was becoming home in ways her Boston boarding house never had. About Samuel, whose rare smiles had begun to appear more frequently when he looked at her, as if he was seeing past the practical arrangement to the person underneath. And about herself. About discovering strengths she hadn't known she possessed. About learning that sometimes the only way to heal from one kind of wound was to prove you could survive an entirely different battle. 2 weeks after the fire, a letter arrived from Thomas Whitfield. Eleanor opened it with trembling hands, Samuel and Caleb watching from across the kitchen table. The morning sun slanted through the window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. Dear Eleanor, the letter began, your account of events in Clearwater Creek has caused quite a stir here at the Globe. My editor is extremely interested in running a series of articles about Consolidated Western's practices. However, we need more than your testimony alone. We need documentation, witnesses, evidence of a pattern of intimidation that can be verified independently. Can you provide this? Eleanor looked up to find Samuel's eyes on her. He wants proof, documentation, more than just my word against Whitmore's. How much proof does he need? Samuel's voice was tight. They tried to burn down my barn with my wife inside. That's attempted murder, which we can't prove in court because Taggart will deny everything, and we have no witnesses besides ourselves and the Cartwrights, who'd be dismissed as biased neighbors. Eleanor scanned the rest of Thomas's letter, her mind racing. But if there are other ranchers, other victims of Consolidated Western's intimidation, and if we can document a pattern of behavior, there are others. Samuel stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Jim Morrison over in Carbon County, Consolidated Western tried to force him off land they wanted for a rail spur. The Hendersons lost their water rights in what everyone knew was a rigged legal proceeding. There's been at least half a dozen small ranchers and settlers who've had trouble with Whitmore's people over the past 2 years. Will they talk? Will they go on record? Eleanor's pulse quickened. This could work. A coordinated exposé showing Consolidated Western's systematic abuse of power, published in a major Eastern newspaper where Whitmore's investors would see it. The court of public opinion might accomplish what territorial law could not. Samuel turned from the window, his expression conflicted. Some might, others are too scared or too beaten down. Morrison moved his family to Colorado rather than keep fighting. The Hendersons sold out at a loss and headed to Oregon, getting people to dredge up painful memories and expose themselves to potential retaliation. He shook his head. That's asking a lot. I know. Eleanor folded the letter carefully. But it might be the only way to stop this. Not just for us, but for everyone Whitmore might target in the future. Caleb had been quiet through this exchange, his slate forgotten in front of him. Now he spoke up, his young voice serious. If we get proof and send it to the newspapers, will the bad men leave us alone? Eleanor and Samuel exchanged glances. How did you explain to a child that justice was complicated, that sometimes doing the right thing made you more of a target before it made you safer? We hope so, son, Samuel said finally. That's what we're fighting for. Eleanor made the decision then, looking at Caleb's worried face and Samuel's tired eyes. I'll go. I'll visit the other ranchers, collect their stories, document everything I can. Thomas needs evidence, and I'll get it for him. Absolutely not. Samuel's response was immediate and sharp. You think I'm letting you ride all over Wyoming territory interviewing people who've been targeted by the same men who tried to kill you? That's insanity. Then come with me. Eleanor stood, facing him across the table. We'll go together. Visit the ranchers, gather statements, build a case that's ironclad. Ben can watch Caleb in the ranch. Eleanor, Samuel started, but she cut him off. This is the fight we're in, Samuel. We can hunker down and defend, hoping they eventually give up, or we can go on the offensive, force them into the light where they can't operate with impunity. Eleanor's voice was steady, certain. I didn't come all this way to cower, and I don't think you're the kind of man who backs down either. Samuel stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly, something shifted in his expression. The resistance faded, replaced by a kind of grim determination Eleanor recognized from the night he'd returned to find his barn damaged and his wife bruised but standing. You're right, he said quietly. Running hasn't worked. Defending hasn't worked. Maybe it's time to take this fight to them. They spent the next 3 days planning. Ben Cartwright agreed to move into the ranch while they were gone, bringing 2 of his sons for additional security. Eleanor wrote careful letters to the ranchers Samuel identified, explaining their purpose and asking for meetings. She packed supplies for a journey that would take them through some of the roughest country in the territory, places where settlements were days apart, and help was a luxury you couldn't count on. Caleb took the news of their departure better than Eleanor expected, though she saw the fear flickering in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. The night before they left, she found him in the barn, sitting in the hayloft where he often retreated when troubled. Can I come up? Eleanor asked from the ladder. Caleb nodded, and she climbed into the loft, settling beside him in the sweet-smelling hay. Through the open loft door they could see stars emerging in the darkening sky, brilliant and infinite. You're scared we won't come back, Eleanor said. Not a question. Caleb's hands twisted in his lap. Ma went to town one day and didn't come back. She got sick and then she was just gone. His voice was small, younger than his 8 years. What if something happens to you and Pa? Eleanor's heart clenched. This child had already lost so much, and now she and Samuel were leaving him to chase justice that might be nothing more than a dream. But they couldn't protect him by hiding. The only real protection was ending the threat permanently. Your mother got sick with something nobody could prevent or control, Eleanor said gently. That was cruel and unfair and absolutely not your fault or anyone's fault. It was just the terrible randomness of life. She took Caleb's hand in hers. What your father and I are doing is different. We're choosing to face a threat we can actually do something about. We're not being reckless. We're being strategic. And we're doing it so you can grow up on this ranch without fear, without looking over your shoulder waiting for bad men to come finish what they started. But what if, Caleb's voice broke, what if is the question that will paralyze you if you let it? Eleanor squeezed his hand. Your father taught me something without meaning to. He showed me that sometimes the scariest thing is also the necessary thing. That running from fear doesn't make you safer. It just makes you smaller. She turned to look at him directly. I'm coming back, Caleb. Your father is coming back. And when we do, we're going to have the evidence we need to end this threat once and for all. That's a promise. Caleb searched her face in the dimming light. You promise? Really? I promise. Eleanor pulled him into a hug, feeling his thin arms wrap around her waist. And I keep my promises. You should know that about me by now. They left at dawn 2 days later, riding north toward Carbon County, where Jim Morrison had relocated before moving to Colorado. Samuel had managed to track down his new address through mutual acquaintances, and Morrison had sent back a terse telegram agreeing to meet. Eleanor rode the roan mare she'd begun to think of as hers, her rifle secured in the saddle holster, her saddlebags packed with notebooks and writing supplies alongside the more practical necessities of frontier travel. Samuel rode beside her on his bay gelding, silent and watchful. They'd fallen into an easy partnership over the weeks of their marriage, learning each other's rhythms and habits. Eleanor discovered that Samuel was most communicative in the early mornings and late evenings, that he had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he felt comfortable, that he was fiercely protective but also respected her competence enough not to coddle her. And Samuel had learned that Eleanor was tougher than she looked, that her education masked a core of determination that wouldn't bend under pressure, that she had a strategic mind that complemented his more direct approach. They made a good team, Eleanor thought, better than either of them had probably expected when they'd exchanged vows in that Clearwater Creek courthouse. The journey to Morrison's place took 3 days of hard riding through country that grew progressively wilder. They camped at night under stars so bright, Eleanor felt she could reach up and touch them, sharing simple meals cooked over a campfire, and talking about everything and nothing. Samuel told her about his childhood on the ranch, about his father's dreams and his mother's early death in childbirth. Eleanor shared carefully edited stories about Boston, about teaching, about the parts of her past that didn't hurt too much to revisit. You never talk about why you left, Samuel observed one night, his face shadowed in the firelight. Just that you needed a fresh start. Eleanor poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks spiral into the darkness. She'd known this conversation would come eventually. The question was how much truth to share, how much vulnerability to risk. There was a man, she said finally, Marcus Pemberton. He taught mathematics at the boys' academy adjacent to my school. He decided he wanted me to be more than a colleague, and when I refused his advances, he made it his mission to destroy my reputation. The words came easier than she'd expected, maybe because the darkness made confession simpler. He spread rumors about improper conduct, made implications to the headmaster and board of trustees, manufactured evidence of indiscretions that never happened. Samuel's jaw tightened in the firelight. And they believed him? Over you? Of course they did. He was a man with family connections and social standing. I was a single woman with no influential relatives to defend me. Eleanor's voice hardened. The headmaster called me into his office, told me very solemnly that while he personally believed I was innocent, the appearance of impropriety was just as damaging as actual impropriety. He accepted my resignation, which we both knew wasn't really a resignation at all. That's why you understood so quickly about Consolidated Western. Samuel's voice was thoughtful. You'd already experienced what happens when powerful people decide the truth doesn't matter as much as their version of events. Exactly. Eleanor met his eyes across the fire. I've lived through having my word dismissed, my character assassinated, my future destroyed by men who faced no consequences for their lies. I won't go through it again, and I won't stand by while it happens to others if I have the power to stop it. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry that happened to you, and I'm grateful it brought you here, even though I hate the circumstances that made it necessary." Something warm unfurled in Eleanor's chest. Not love, not yet, but something adjacent to it. Trust, maybe. The beginning of true partnership between two people who'd started as strangers, brought together by need. "I'm not sorry anymore," Eleanor admitted. "I was, for a long time. Angry and bitter and full of regret. But now..." She gestured at the vast darkness around them, at the stars overhead, at the life she was building in this harsh country. "Now I think maybe it was necessary. Maybe I needed to lose everything to discover what I was actually capable of when there was nothing left to lose." They found Morrison in a small settlement outside Rawlins, working as a clerk in a general store. A profound step down for a man who'd once owned 300 acres of good grazing land. He was thin and worn, with the defeated look of someone who'd fought too hard for too long and finally broken under the weight of it. But when Eleanor explained their purpose, something flickered in his eyes. Not hope, exactly, but perhaps the ghost of the fighting spirit he'd once possessed. "You really think exposing them in the newspapers will change anything?" Morrison asked, pouring coffee in the back room of the store where they could talk privately. "Whitmore's got enough money to buy his way out of bad publicity." "Maybe," Eleanor acknowledged, "but his investors don't want to be associated with a company that uses arson and attempted murder to acquire property. Even if Whitmore himself doesn't face legal consequences, the financial pressure from nervous investors might force him to change tactics, or at least make him think twice before targeting someone else." Morrison studied her face, then Samuel's. "You two know what you're risking? Whitmore doesn't forgive people who cross him. You go public with this. You're painting targets on your backs permanently." "The targets are already there," Samuel said quietly. "They tried to burn my barn with my wife inside. We're past the point of appeasement." "Fair enough." Morrison pulled out a battered ledger from beneath the counter. "I kept records. Every threat, every incident, every suspicious accident or financial setback that happened after I refused to sell. Dates, times, names when I had them. Figured someday someone might care enough to use it." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the ledger. This was exactly what Thomas needed: documentation, evidence, proof of systematic intimidation. "Thank you. This is incredibly valuable." "Just make it count." Morrison's voice was rough with old grief and anger. "I lost everything because I wouldn't back down. My wife lost faith in me. My children grew up thinking their father was a failure who couldn't protect them. If my story can prevent that from happening to other families, then maybe it wasn't all for nothing." They spent 2 hours with Morrison, Eleanor taking meticulous notes while Samuel asked clarifying questions. By the time they left, Eleanor's notebooks were full of dates and incidents, and the kind of detailed evidence that would make Thomas's editors very happy indeed. Over the next 2 weeks, they repeated this process with 5 other families. The Hendersons, who'd been driven off their land through a combination of legal manipulation and outright intimidation. The widow Chen, whose husband had died in what was ruled an accident, but which she insisted was murder after he'd refused to sell mining rights. The Patterson brothers, who'd been bankrupted by mysterious cattle die-offs and equipment failures. Each story added another layer to the picture Eleanor was building, a comprehensive account of consolidated Western systematic abuse of power across multiple counties and several years. Some of the interviews were conducted in comfortable homes, others in tents or makeshift shelters that spoke to how far the families had fallen. Some people were eager to talk, grateful someone was finally listening. Others were reluctant, afraid that speaking out would invite renewed retaliation. Eleanor handled each conversation with the patience and skill of a born teacher, coaxing out details while respecting people's trauma and fear. Samuel watched her work with growing respect. This woman he'd married out of desperation was proving to be far more than he'd bargained for. She had a mind like a steel trap, missing nothing, connecting patterns he wouldn't have seen. She had empathy that put frightened people at ease. and she had a core of determined fury that reminded him of his father, the same stubborn refusal to let bullies win, the same willingness to fight even when the odds were impossibly bad. On the journey home, they stopped at a small territorial courthouse where Eleanor had arranged to have several of their witness statements notarized. The clerk who handled the paperwork was an older man with shrewd eyes who studied the documents carefully. "This about Consolidated Western?" he asked, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry beyond his desk. Eleanor glanced at Samuel, who gave a slight nod. "Yes, we're documenting their practices for publication in Eastern newspapers." The clerk's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "About time someone did. I've processed 3 property transfers in the past year where I'd bet my last dollar the sellers were coerced. But proving it in court is another matter. Whitmore's lawyers are very good at making everything look legal and above board." "That's why we're going to the newspapers instead," Eleanor said. "Let the court of public opinion do what territorial courts won't." "Brave." The clerk stamped the final document with a decisive thud. "Or foolish, probably both. But I wish you luck. Some of us who work in the system know exactly how corrupt it's become. We just don't have the power to fight it alone." They rode the final stretch home through early November weather that threatened snow. Eleanor's saddlebags were heavy with notebooks and statements, her mind already composing the letter she would send to Thomas. She had everything he'd asked for and more, a comprehensive case that would be impossible for Whitmore to dismiss or explain away. As they crested the final ridge before the valley where the ranch lay, Eleanor saw smoke rising from the chimney. The barn stood solid despite its scarred timbers. Cattle grazed in the near pasture. Everything looked peaceful, normal, safe. But Eleanor knew that peace was temporary. The real battle was about to begin. Not with guns and fire, but with words and truth and the power of exposure. She was ready for it, more than ready. Samuel reached over and took her hand the first time he'd initiated such contact. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Eleanor squeezed his hand in return, feeling the calluses that spoke of hard work and honest labor. "Together," she agreed. They rode down into the valley. As the first snowflakes began to fall, 2 people who'd started as strangers bound by desperation and were becoming something else entirely. Partners, allies. Maybe, eventually, something more. But first, they had a fight to win. And Eleanor Hart, who'd once fled conflict in Boston, was done running. She was planting her feet, raising her voice, and daring Maxwell Whitmore to try to silence her. The man would learn what men before him had failed to understand. Eleanor Price might have been broken, but Eleanor Hart was made of sterner stuff, forged in frontier fire and tempered by injustice, overcome. And she was just getting started. Caleb met them at the edge of the property, riding his buckskin pony at a speed that made Eleanor's heart leap into her throat. But he was grinning, truly grinning for the first time since she'd met him, and when he reached them, he practically launched himself from his saddle into Samuel's arms. "You came back! You both came back!" Caleb's voice was muffled against his father's shoulder, but Eleanor heard the relief in it, the fear that had finally been allowed to release. Samuel held his son tight, one hand cradling the back of Caleb's head. "Told you we would. Hearts keep their promises." Caleb pulled back enough to look at Eleanor, his eyes bright. "Did you get what you needed? Did people talk to you?" "They talked," Eleanor confirmed, dismounting with legs stiff from days in the saddle. "We have everything we need and then some. Now comes the hard part, putting it all together in a way that can't be ignored." Ben Cartwright emerged from the barn, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Good to see you both in one piece. Was starting to worry when that storm rolled through yesterday." "We sheltered in a line shack near the Henderson place," Samuel said, setting Caleb down but keeping one hand on his son's shoulder, as if reassuring himself the boy was real and safe. "Any trouble here?" "Quiet as a Sunday morning. Few riders passed by on the main road, but nobody came onto the property. Taggart and his boys seemed to be laying low." Ben's expression turned serious. "Which worries me more than if they'd made another move. Quiet men plotting are more dangerous than loud men threatening." Eleanor knew he was right. In the 3 weeks since the barn fire, Consolidated Western had made no further attempts at intimidation. No cut fences, no missing cattle, no midnight visitors. Just silence, which could mean either they'd given up or they were planning something bigger. That night, after Caleb had finally been coaxed to bed and Ben had retired to the bunkhouse, Eleanor and Samuel sat at the kitchen table surrounded by notebooks and statements. The lamp cast a circle of warm light in the darkness, creating an island of purpose in the quiet house. "There's a pattern," Eleanor said, her finger tracing connections between different accounts. Every time someone refused to sell, the same sequence of events followed. First came the reasonable offer. Then when that was refused, came the accidents, livestock losses, equipment failures, things that could be explained away as bad luck. Then came the direct threats, usually delivered by Taggart or men like him. And finally, if people still wouldn't sell, came the violence or legal manipulation that forced them off their land. Samuel studied the timeline she'd created. We're in the final stage. They've tried intimidation, they've tried violence with the barn fire. Next comes either another escalation or they'll try to destroy us financially through the courts. Which is why we need to move first. Eleanor pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began drafting the letter to Thomas Whitfield. Her handwriting was steady despite her exhaustion, each word chosen with care. This wasn't just correspondence between friends. This was ammunition. Evidence. The foundation for a fight that would be waged in newspaper columns and investor meetings rather than with guns and fire. She wrote through the night, Samuel eventually dozing in his chair while Eleanor's pen scratched across page after page. She detailed every incident, named every victim, connected every thread of Consolidated Western's systematic abuse of power. She wrote with the clarity of a teacher explaining a complex topic and the passion of someone who'd experienced injustice firsthand. By the time dawnlight began filtering through the windows, she had 15 pages of tightly written testimony that would make any editor sit up and take notice. "It's good," Samuel said, reading over her shoulder. He'd woken an hour earlier but had sat quietly, not wanting to disturb her concentration. "Better than good. It's damning. Whitmore won't be able to explain this away." "He'll try." Eleanor set down her pen, flexing fingers cramped from hours of writing. Men like him always do. He'll call it biased reporting, claim we're disgruntled troublemakers with an axe to grind. But the sheer number of victims, the documented pattern, the notarized statements, that's harder to dismiss. She sealed the letter along with copies of the most crucial witness statements and addressed it to Thomas Whitfield at the Boston Globe. Samuel would take it to town that morning, send it by the fastest post available. Then they would wait and prepare for whatever response came. But Eleanor wasn't content to simply wait. Over the next 2 weeks, while Samuel worked on winterizing the ranch and preparing for the harsh months ahead, Eleanor wrote more letters. She wrote to the territorial governor, detailing Consolidated Western's practices and requesting an investigation. She wrote to the territorial newspaper in Cheyenne, sending them a condensed version of her report. She even wrote to several of Whitmore's known investors back east, politely inquiring whether they were aware of how their capital was being employed in Wyoming territory. "You're poking a hornet's nest with a very sharp stick," Ben observed one afternoon, watching Eleanor seal yet another envelope. He'd taken to stopping by regularly, ostensibly to check on the ranch, but really, Eleanor suspected, to make sure they were still alive and unmolested. "I'm making sure the hornets know they're being watched," Eleanor corrected, "that their actions have witnesses and consequences. Men like Whitmore rely on operating in darkness. I'm turning on every light I can find." The response came faster than Eleanor expected. 2 weeks after sending her initial letter to Thomas, a telegram arrived from the Clearwater Creek post office. Samuel brought it home with hands that trembled slightly as he passed it to Eleanor. She opened it with her heart pounding. The message was brief. Article published, stop response significant. Stop investors demanding answers. Stop more to follow. Stop Whitfield. "It worked," Eleanor whispered, reading the telegram 3 times to make sure she understood correctly. "Thomas published it, and people are paying attention." Samuel pulled her into an embrace that was becoming more natural between them, the careful distance of their early marriage eroding with each shared challenge. "You did it! You actually did it!" But Eleanor's mind was already racing ahead to the next moves, the potential consequences. "This is just the beginning. Whitmore will respond. We need to be ready." The response came 2 days later, though not in the form Eleanor had anticipated. Instead of Taggart and his thugs, instead of more threats or violence, a well-dressed man in an expensive suit arrived at the ranch in a private carriage. He introduced himself as James Hendricks, attorney for Consolidated Western Mineral. Eleanor invited him into the house with Samuel close beside her, both of them tense and wary. Caleb had been sent to the Cartwrights for the afternoon. No need to expose him to whatever confrontation this visit might bring. Hendricks accepted coffee with polite thanks and settled into a chair with the ease of someone accustomed to being comfortable anywhere. "I'll be direct, Mrs. Hart, Mr. Hart. My client is deeply concerned about the recent allegations published in the Boston Globe and echoed in several other newspapers. He feels these allegations are based on misunderstandings and unfortunate coincidences that have been misconstrued." "Misunderstandings," Eleanor repeated, her voice flat. "Is that what we're calling attempted arson and death threats now?" Hendricks had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I understand there have been incidents, regrettable incidents, but my client maintains that these were the actions of overzealous employees acting without his knowledge or approval. Mr. Whitmore himself had no idea." "Your client hired Taggart," Samuel interrupted, his voice hard. "Taggart doesn't do anything without orders. So either Whitmore is lying about giving those orders, or he's incompetent at managing his own employees. Either way, he's responsible." "Be that as it may," Hendricks continued smoothly, "Mr. Whitmore is prepared to make a gesture of good faith to resolve this matter amicably. He's willing to offer you $50,000 for a permanent easement across your land to access Clearwater Creek, plus an additional $10,000 in compensation for damages to your property and distress caused to your family." The number hung in the air, staggering in its magnitude. $60,000 was more money than Eleanor had ever imagined having. It was enough to pay off every debt, expand the ranch, secure Caleb's future with funds left over. It was financial security of a kind that most frontier families could only dream about. Eleanor looked at Samuel and saw the conflict in his face. The practical part of him that knew what that money could mean, warring with the stubborn pride that had kept him fighting this long. "And in exchange for this generous offer?" Eleanor asked, knowing there had to be conditions. "Mr. Whitmore would require a signed statement from both of you retracting your allegations and acknowledging that any difficulties you experienced were misunderstandings. Additionally, you would agree not to make any further public statements about Consolidated Western or its business practices." Hendricks pulled out a prepared contract, setting it on the table between them. "This is a limited-time offer, good for 48 hours. After that, Mr. Whitmore will be forced to pursue other remedies, including legal action for defamation." There it was, the trap wrapped in velvet. Take the money in silence or face the full weight of Whitmore's legal and financial resources in a fight that could bankrupt them, even if they won. Eleanor felt Samuel's hand find hers under the table, squeezing gently. A question and a promise wrapped together. Whatever they decided together. "Mr. Hendricks?" Eleanor said carefully. "Would you excuse us for a moment? My husband and I need to discuss this privately." "Of course." Hendricks stood, moving to examine the books on Samuel's shelf, with the casual interest of someone who had all the time in the world. Eleanor and Samuel stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind them. The November air was cold and sharp, carrying the promise of snow. In the distance, cattle grazed peacefully, unaware that their future was being negotiated inside the house. $60,000, Samuel said quietly. "That's more than this ranch will earn in 10 years, even in good years." "I know." Eleanor leaned against the porch rail, her mind churning through possibilities and consequences. "It would solve every financial problem we have. Secure Caleb's future. Let us live without constantly looking over our shoulders. But it would mean letting Whitmore win. It would mean abandoning every other family he'll target after us. It would mean teaching Caleb that powerful men can buy their way out of accountability for their actions." Eleanor turned to face Samuel. "And it would mean I broke my promise to all those people who trusted me with their stories. Morrison and the Hendersons and the widow Chen and all the others who thought maybe this time someone would actually fight for them." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning the land his father had claimed and built and passed down with the weight of legacy and expectation. My father used to say that a man's worth isn't measured by what he owns, but by what he's willing to sacrifice for what's right. I never really understood that until now. What are you saying? I'm saying that money can't buy back your integrity once you've sold it. I'm saying that some fights are worth having even when the odds are bad and the cost is high. Samuel took Eleanor's hands in his expression more open than she'd ever seen it. I'm saying that I'd rather lose this ranch fighting for what's right than keep it by betraying everything my father taught me and everything you've shown me about courage. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, not of sadness, but of fierce pride in this man she'd married as a stranger and was learning to love as a partner. Then we tell him no. We tell him hell no, Samuel corrected with a slight smile. They returned to the house together, united in purpose. Hendricks looked up from the book he'd been perusing, reading their decision in their linked hands and set faces. Mr. Hendricks, Eleanor said before the lawyer could speak, you can tell Mr. Whitmore that we decline his offer. We will not be retracting our statements because every word we said was true. We will not be silenced because we have nothing to be ashamed of. And if Mr. Whitmore wants to sue us for defamation, we welcome the opportunity to present all our evidence in a public courtroom where his business practices can be examined under oath. Hendricks's professional composure slipped for just a moment, revealing surprise and perhaps a hint of respect. You understand you're refusing a life-changing amount of money? That you're choosing a very difficult path when an easy one is being offered? We understand perfectly, Samuel said. Now I'd appreciate it if you'd leave my property. We have work to do. After Hendricks departed, his carriage wheels kicking up dust on the road back to town, Eleanor and Samuel stood together on the porch, watching the sun sink toward the mountains. The decision they'd made would have consequences, legal battles, financial strain, possibly renewed attempts at intimidation. But Eleanor felt lighter than she had in months, as if some weight she'd been carrying had finally been set down. No regrets? Samuel asked quietly. Not even one. Eleanor leaned into his side and his arm came around her shoulders with comfortable familiarity. Though I should probably warn Thomas that Whitmore is threatening to sue, he'll need to prepare the Globe's legal team. Always thinking ahead. Someone has to. Eleanor smiled up at him. Besides, I have a feeling Whitmore's threat is mostly bluster. The last thing he wants is discovery proceedings where we can subpoena his business records and put Taggart on the witness stand under oath. She was proven right 2 weeks later when a second telegram arrived from Thomas. This one was longer, more detailed. Whitmore quietly withdrawing from Wyoming operations. Stop investors spooked by publicity. Stop. Several pulling funding. Stop. You won. Stop. Full story to follow. Stop. Congratulations. Stop. Eleanor read the telegram aloud to Samuel and Caleb over dinner, her voice shaking with emotion she couldn't quite contain. They'd won, not through violence or legal maneuvering, but through the simple act of telling the truth loud enough that people couldn't ignore it. What does it mean? Caleb asked, his eyes wide. Are the bad men going away? It means, Samuel said, his hand covering Eleanor's on the table, that sometimes doing the right thing actually works. It means your Eleanor Ma was braver and smarter than a whole company of rich men who thought they could intimidate us into silence. Caleb looked at Eleanor with an expression that made her throat tight. You saved us. We saved each other, Eleanor corrected gently. Your father for having the courage to fight when giving up would have been easier. You for riding through the dark to get help when the barn was burning. And yes, me for knowing how to turn words into weapons when guns and fire weren't enough. That's what families do. They save each other. The winter that followed was harsh, but the ranch endured. Samuel used the money from his cattle sale to make repairs and purchase feed for the livestock. Eleanor discovered she had a talent for managing the household finances, stretching every dollar until it screamed while somehow keeping them comfortable and well-fed. And Caleb flourished under Eleanor's teaching, his reading improving dramatically as his trust in her grew. More letters arrived from Thomas over the following months, detailing the fallout from the Globe's expose. Consolidated Western had indeed withdrawn from Wyoming territory, their investors spooked by the bad publicity and the potential for legal liability. Maxwell Whitmore had resigned from the company entirely, though rumors suggested he'd been forced out by a board of directors desperate to distance themselves from the scandal. Taggart and several of his men had been arrested on outstanding warrants in other territories. Apparently their work for Whitmore hadn't been their first foray into intimidation and violence. And perhaps most satisfying, several of the families Eleanor had interviewed reported receiving settlements from Consolidated Western's remaining leadership, who were trying to clean up the company's reputation. Not full restitution for what they'd lost, but enough to help them start rebuilding. "You change things," Samuel said one evening in early spring. They were sitting on the porch watching Caleb play with a new puppy Ben Cartwright had brought by, claiming his dog had birthed more puppies than he knew what to do with. The air smelled of warming earth and new growth, the world coming back to life after winter's dormancy. "Not just for us, but for all of them. You gave them something they'd lost. Hope that justice was possible." Eleanor leaned her head against Samuel's shoulder, comfortable in a way she'd never been with another person. "I just told the truth. The rest was people finally being willing to listen. It was more than that." Samuel's arm tightened around her. "You stood up when standing up could have gotten you killed. You fought when fighting seemed hopeless. He paused, seeming to struggle with words. "You saved this ranch. You saved Caleb. You saved me from becoming the kind of bitter, defeated man I saw in Morrison's eyes." Eleanor turned to look at him, seeing in his face something that had been growing between them for months but hadn't yet been named. "Samuel, I love you." The words came out rough, unpracticed, as if he wasn't entirely sure how to say them. "I know that wasn't part of our arrangement. I know you came here fleeing one situation and looking for practical security, not romance. But I need you to know that somewhere between you stepping off that stagecoach and now, this stopped being a marriage of convenience and became something real, at least for me." Eleanor's heart felt too large for her chest. She'd been so focused on fighting external battles that she'd barely noticed the internal transformation happening in her own feelings. But Samuel was right. This had become real. She cared about this man, about his quiet strength and stubborn integrity. She'd come to treasure their evening conversations and the way he looked at her like she was remarkable instead of merely useful. "I love you too," Eleanor admitted, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. "I didn't expect to. I thought I'd be content with respect and partnership and a safe place to rebuild my life. But you've given me so much more than that. You've given me a home, a family, a purpose beyond just survival." Samuel kissed her then, properly this time, not the formal brush of lips from their wedding, but something genuine and deep and full of promise. When they pulled apart, Eleanor was breathless and grinning, feeling younger than she had in years. "Does this mean you're really my ma now?" Caleb's voice made them both jump. The boy stood at the bottom of the porch steps, the puppy wriggling in his arms, his expression cautiously hopeful. Eleanor laughed, wiping at her eyes. "If you want me to be. I know I'm not your first mother, Caleb. I could never replace Hope. But if you'll let me, I'd be honored to be your mother in my own way." Caleb considered this with his characteristic seriousness. Then he smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his whole face. "I'd like that. You're different from Ma, but different isn't bad. Different is just different." "Wise words from a very smart boy," Samuel said, pulling Caleb up onto the porch and into a three-way embrace that felt like the family they'd become rather than the practical arrangement they'd started as. That night, after Caleb had been tucked into bed with his new puppy curled at his feet, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table reviewing the ranch's accounts. They were in better shape than they'd been in years, thanks to careful management and the absence of Consolidated Western's interference. There was even a small surplus, enough to consider improvements like expanding the herd or adding irrigation for a larger kitchen garden. Samuel emerged from the bedroom they now shared, having finally moved Eleanor's belongings from the small downstairs room to the larger space upstairs. It had felt like a significant step, an acknowledgement that their marriage had evolved beyond its business-like origins. "Come to bed," Samuel said, leaning against the door frame. "The numbers will still be there tomorrow." Eleanor started to argue, then realized she didn't want to. The accounts could wait. What mattered was this home, this family, this life they were building together. She stood, moving into Samuel's arms with the easy affection of a wife who knew she was cherished. "I have something to tell you," Eleanor said against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her cheek. "I wasn't sure at first, but I've been to see the doctor in town, and he confirmed it. I'm expecting a child, our child." Samuel went very still. Then he pulled back to look at her face, his expression cycling through shock and joy and something that might have been awe. "A baby? We're having a baby?" "Due in late September, the doctor thinks." Eleanor smiled at his wonder. "I know we haven't talked about expanding our family, and if you're not ready—" "Not ready. Eleanor, I'm—" Samuel seemed to run out of words. Instead, he lifted her off her feet and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "A baby. A brother or sister for Caleb. A new start for all of us." They told Caleb the next morning over breakfast. His initial response was confusion. Where exactly did babies come from, and how long did they take, and would it be a boy or a girl? But beneath the questions, Eleanor saw excitement building. The idea of being a big brother seemed to appeal to him. "Will the baby look like me or like you?" Caleb asked, studying Eleanor's face thoughtfully. "Maybe a little of both," Eleanor said. "That's how it usually works. Though honestly, babies all look pretty much the same when they're first born. Small and wrinkly and loud." Caleb giggled, then grew serious again. "Will you still have time to teach me if there's a baby?" "Always." Eleanor reached across the table to take his hand. "You're my son, Caleb. Having another child doesn't change that. You'll always be important to me, always be loved, always be part of this family." "Good," Caleb said, satisfied. Then, with the resilience of childhood, he returned his attention to his breakfast as if the conversation had been about something far less momentous. The months that followed were perhaps the happiest of Eleanor's life. Spring gave way to summer, and the ranch thrived under their combined management. Samuel handled the livestock and land, while Eleanor managed the household and finances with increasing confidence. They worked together to plant an expanded garden, including the yellow flowers Caleb insisted on for his first mother's memory, and made improvements to the property that had been deferred for too long. Eleanor's pregnancy progressed smoothly, though the summer heat made her uncomfortable and the baby seemed determined to kick at the most inconvenient times. Samuel was absurdly protective, trying to prevent her from doing anything more strenuous than sitting in the shade with a cool drink. Eleanor ignored him cheerfully and continued managing the household, teaching Caleb and corresponding with the families they'd helped during their fight against Consolidated Western. Several of those families had written to thank her, sharing news of their own recoveries and fresh starts. Morrison had taken his settlement money and purchased a small ranch in Colorado, writing that for the first time in years he felt like himself again. The widow Chen had reopened her late husband's mining claim, hiring honest workers and turning a modest profit. The Hendersons had returned to Wyoming, reclaiming land that Consolidated Western had abandoned in their hasty withdrawal. "You gave them their lives back," Samuel observed, reading over Eleanor's shoulder as she composed a response to Morrison's latest letter. His hand rested on her swollen belly, feeling the baby move beneath his palm. "They gave me mine back too," Eleanor said truthfully. "Fighting for them taught me that I didn't have to accept injustice quietly, that my voice mattered, that I could make a difference." In late September, when the aspens turned gold in the mountains and the air carried the first hint of autumn's chill, Eleanor went into labor. The birth was attended by Mrs. Patterson from town, who'd become a friend over the months, and took the better part of a day. Samuel wore a path in the floorboards, pacing while Caleb sat on the porch with his puppy, trying not to look worried. When the baby finally arrived, a daughter with a shock of dark hair and lungs that announced her displeasure at being born, Eleanor held her and felt something shift in her understanding of the world. This tiny creature was hers and Samuel's, a living symbol of their partnership and the life they'd built from the wreckage of their separate pasts. "She's perfect," Samuel whispered, touching the baby's miniature hand with a finger that seemed enormous by comparison. "What should we name her?" Eleanor had been thinking about this for months. "I'd like to call her Grace. Grace Hope Hart." She looked up at Samuel, seeing understanding dawn in his eyes. Hope for your first wife, who should be remembered and honored. Grace because that's what I found here. The grace to start over, to heal, to become someone stronger than I was. Samuel's eyes were wet. She would have liked that. Hope would have liked knowing she wasn't forgotten, that she's still part of our family's story. They brought Caleb in to meet his sister, watching as his expression cycled through curiosity and wonder and a tentative kind of love. She's really small, he observed, touching Grace's cheek with gentle fingers. Will she get bigger? Eventually, Eleanor assured him. For now, she mostly needs to sleep and eat and be held, but as she grows, she'll need a big brother to teach her things and protect her and show her how to be brave. Caleb's chest puffed with pride at the responsibility. I can do that. I'm good at being brave now. You taught me. As autumn deepened and winter approached once again, the Hart family settled into new rhythms. Samuel and Eleanor managed the ranch while caring for their infant daughter, who proved to have her mother's stubbornness and her father's quiet determination. Caleb took his role as big brother seriously, helping with small tasks and telling Grace long stories about the ranch and the animals, and the time his Eleanor Ma had faced down bad men with nothing but a rifle and fierce courage. Letters continued to arrive from Thomas Whitfield, who'd apparently decided that Eleanor's story was too good not to follow up on. He'd written a series of articles about frontier justice and corporate accountability that had won him recognition and a promotion. He offered Eleanor a standing invitation to contribute pieces about life in Wyoming Territory, and she'd taken him up on it occasionally, sending essays about homesteading and women's education and the challenges facing frontier families. The small income from her writing helped, but more than that, it gave Eleanor a sense of purpose beyond the ranch. She was still a teacher at heart, still someone who believed in the power of words and ideas to change minds and circumstances. Now she had a platform to share that belief with a wider audience. One evening in December, almost exactly a year after Eleanor had first arrived in Clearwater Creek, the family gathered around the table for dinner. Snow fell softly outside, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. Grace dozed in a cradle near the fire, well-fed and content. Caleb was practicing his letters, his handwriting growing neater with each passing week. Samuel sat beside Eleanor, their hands linked on the table in casual affection. Do you ever regret it? Samuel asked quietly. Leaving Boston? Coming here? Everything you gave up to start over? Eleanor considered the question seriously, looking around at the life she'd built, the house she'd made into a home, the husband she'd come to love, the stepson who called her mother, the daughter who bore her eyes in Samuel's stubborn chin, the ranch they'd defended together, the fight they'd won not with violence, but with truth. Not for a single moment, she said honestly. I thought I was coming here to escape my past, to hide from scandal and start over in anonymity. But what I found was so much more than that. I found my voice again, my courage, my purpose. I found a family I chose and who chose me back. Samuel squeezed her hand. I was looking for someone to help me survive. Instead, I found someone who taught me how to live again. Caleb looked up from his letters. Are you two being sappy again? Eleanor laughed, reaching over to ruffle his hair. Probably. You'll understand when you're older. Adults are weird, Caleb pronounced, but he was smiling. Later that night, after Caleb had gone to bed and Grace had been nursed and settled in her cradle, Eleanor and Samuel stood on the porch looking out at their land covered in snow. The moon was full and bright, turning everything silver and magical. A year ago, I stepped off a stagecoach in Clearwater Creek thinking my life was over, Eleanor said softly, that I'd failed at everything that mattered and was reduced to marrying a stranger just to survive. And now? Samuel asked, his arm around her shoulders. Now I know that sometimes what looks like an ending is really a beginning, that sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover what you're truly capable of when there's nothing left to lose. Eleanor leaned into her husband's warmth. I came here to marry a cowboy I'd never met, and his son said I looked just like Hope. I was terrified that I'd always be a substitute, a replacement, a poor copy of something irreplaceable. But you're not, Samuel said firmly. You're Eleanor, unique and remarkable and irreplaceable in your own right. Hope was the love of my youth, and I'll always carry her memory with gratitude. But you're the love of the man I've become, stronger and better for knowing you. Eleanor turned in his arms, looking up at his face in the moonlight. This man who'd been a stranger, this life that had been an escape, this family that had been a desperate gamble, all of it had become more real and true than anything she'd left behind. "Thank you," she whispered, "for taking a chance on a disgraced schoolteacher with a ruined reputation and more stubbornness than sense." "Thank you," Samuel replied, "for being brave enough to stay when leaving would have been easier, for fighting for us when I'd almost forgotten how to fight for myself, for showing Caleb and me that family isn't just blood, it's choice and commitment and showing up even when things are hard." They kissed in the moonlight, two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built something beautiful from the wreckage of their separate pasts. When they finally went inside, the house was warm and quiet, filled with the soft sounds of children sleeping and a future worth fighting for. Eleanor Hart had come to Wyoming Territory fleeing scandal and seeking survival. What she'd found instead was home. Not the place she was born, but the place she chose, the people she loved, the life she'd built with her own hands and fierce determination. She'd come expecting uncertainty and found purpose, expected isolation and found community, expected a practical arrangement and found genuine love. The woman who'd arrived on that stagecoach a year ago, broken and afraid and convinced her best days were behind her, would barely recognize the woman Eleanor had become. Strong and confident, a wife and mother, a defender of the vulnerable, a voice for the silenced, a teacher not just to one child but to anyone who read her words and learned that courage was possible even in the face of overwhelming odds. As Eleanor settled into bed beside Samuel that night, with Grace sleeping peacefully nearby and Caleb safely tucked in upstairs, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, complete and utter contentment. The bone-deep satisfaction of knowing she was exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do, with exactly the people she was meant to love. The wind howled outside, winter asserting its dominance over the territory. But inside, the Hart family was warm and safe and together. And that, Eleanor thought, as sleep finally claimed her, was worth more than all the security and respectability Boston could have ever offered. She'd come to marry a stranger. She'd stayed to build a life. And in the process, she'd found something more precious than safety or escape or even justice. She'd found herself, the truest, strongest, most authentic version of Eleanor she'd ever been. The woman who came to marry the cowboy she'd never met had found far more than a husband. She'd found a home, a purpose, and a family she'd chosen with open eyes and an open heart. And she would spend the rest of her days proving that sometimes the best beginnings emerge from the most unexpected endings, and that love, real love, is built not on first impressions or perfect circumstances, but on standing together through fires literal and figurative, choosing each other again and again until choice becomes certainty and certainty becomes forever.